Chapter 2235. In this manner, layer after layer, layer after layer, the number of layers finally reached a level that was beyond anyone's imagination. It felt as if it had almost exceeded the limit of numerical description. It was faintly approaching the limit of Luo Fan's sensing ability. As Luo Fan's observation continued to delve deeper into the microscopic level, the complex and mysterious structure of the barrier became clearer and clearer in his eyes. Unfortunately, the reason behind it was still too high for his level. Even though he had seen it more and more clearly, he still couldn't understand it. He didn't even understand how the barrier worked and how it could forcibly separate the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain in such a way. However, it wasn't completely useless for him to go deeper. In the process of such a deep observation, the details of the interaction between the creation power and the barrier were constantly refined as he went deeper. Originally, he could only see the process of the friction between the creation power and the barrier from a macroscopic perspective, but it gradually turned into more indescribable details. The interaction between the talismans and the creation power was constantly reflected in his eyes and sank into his heart. It's not this. It's not this. As he delved deeper into the microscopic level, Luo Fan speculated and compared, looking for the factor that caused the barrier to consume the creation power. As he continued to delve deeper into the microscopic level, he eliminated more and more factors. In the end, when his in-depth observation was close to the limit of his sensing ability, that was to say, the level of in-depth observation had reached or even almost reached the limit that could be described by numbers, he finally found what he was looking for. When the power of creation came into contact with the extremely deep barrier, strands of it fused with some extremely tiny runes within it. This fusion was different from the previous fusion of so many layers. There were talismans in the previous layers that also fused with the creation power, but that kind of fusion didn't last long. Once it was fused, it would quickly separate again. After that, whether it was the creation power or the talismans, there was no change. It was as if that kind of fusion had never happened. But now, the situation of this fusion was completely different. The current fusion was a kind of fusion that could no longer be separated. In this fusion, not only did the creation power change, but the talismans also became completely different from before. It was this difference that destroyed the integrity of the barrier. As a result, a small portion of the barrier connected to the rune was repelled by the barrier and separated from it. This was the root cause of the countless fine fragments falling from the barrier. After discovering this, all the problems were solved for Luo Fan. Just like in the secular world, if a scientist discovered a certain principle of change, he would soon be able to use this principle to invent a variety of tools that operated according to this principle, which would be of great or small use in a certain aspect. Now that Luo Fan had discovered the principle of the change that allowed the barrier to fall a little, more inspiration emerged in his heart. Instinctively, one divine ability after another emerged from the bottom of his heart. These techniques were none other than techniques that were specifically designed to destroy the barrier. If any one of them were to be used, it would be able to increase the rate at which the Genesis energy wore down the barrier by tens of millions of times. However, it was obvious that an increase of a few million times was not something that Luo Fan was willing to accept. It must be known that although tens of millions of times was shocking, but if the base was small to a certain extent, then such a multiplication would be meaningless. Evidently, with the original speed at which the Genesis energy wore down the barrier, even if it was tens of millions of times faster, it would still be nothing to him. Fortunately, these techniques were only instinctively thought of by him, and they had not been refined or developed in depth. Clearly, there was still a huge potential that could be unearthed. At that moment, countless profound truths began to flow through his heart. The profundities of his worldview, the profundities of concept techniques, and even the various powers contained in his group of worlds all surged out from the depths of his memories like a mountain torrent and filled his entire mind. Along with the countless memories, countless truths, and countless mysteries, he began to modify the divine arts and techniques that had appeared out of instinct before. Every technique became more and more exquisite in the process, and the rate at which it wore down the barrier also became faster and faster. With his understanding of cultivation, as long as he willed it, he could make any kind of supernatural power incomparably exquisite. If he was willing to put in a lot of effort, it was not impossible for him to elevate one of the most ordinary techniques to a level that could shock the disciples of Tao masters. The techniques that were specially used to destroy the barrier were naturally no exception. With his hard work, in just a few days, he had obtained a powerful divine ability that was billions of times more powerful than the most powerful divine ability among the many divine abilities he had instinctively created back then. Although it's still a little slow, it's barely acceptable. Luo Fan sighed as he felt the magical ability that had emerged in his heart, which was close to perfection and could no longer be modified. As he sighed, his heart trembled slightly, and he raised his hand to slap the air beside him. As he slammed his palm down, the boundless Genesis energy in the surroundings seemed to be drawn in by a supreme force, and it began to rapidly gather in the direction of his palm. A mysterious and strange light formed in the center of the gathering of the Genesis energy. This light was extremely strange. It was a faint cyan color and contained a sense of destruction that even surpassed the simple concept of destruction. It felt as if it was the sublimation of the concept of destruction, or rather, the sublimation of the concept of destruction. The cyan light began to expand wildly as the surrounding endless Genesis energy gathered. At first, it was only the size of a palm, but in the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to a radius of several meters. In the blink of an eye, it was already hundreds of meters, tens of thousands of meters. Waves of sound waves began to be born from the contact between the cyan light and the void. They piled up and spread in all directions, turning into a huge sound wave world in the blink of an eye. Countless runes, lines, patterns, and even other lights and shadows began to emerge from the cyan light. Then, the world cluster of sound waves continued to collapse and be born. The speed at which they were born was much faster than the speed at which they collapsed. The world cluster of sound waves was pushed by the newly born world cluster to surge in all directions. It was about to surpass the scale of all the world clusters in the rogue cultivator's territory. Under the cyan light, all kinds of strange lights and shadows kept appearing and disappearing from the center. In the end, at a certain moment, an aura that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with spread out from the center of the light and shadow. That was the aura of the Tao Master's domain. Back then, it took a lot of effort to create a fist-sized passage to the Tao Master's domain. But this time, with just a slap, he had created a huge passage that was several meters in radius. Moreover, this passage did not stop expanding after that. Instead, it continued to expand at an even faster speed in all directions, constantly expanding. It's finally completely opened. Seeing this, Luo Fan let out a long breath. When he created the God Art, he had already set up a setting for it. This setting meant that once the God Art appeared, it would not rest until the barrier was destroyed. Either the God Art itself would disappear, or the barrier would disappear. As long as neither of the two was achieved, the foundation of the God Art would frantically absorb the endless power of creation in the surroundings and turn it into its driving force, pushing it to continuously strengthen and expand. In other words, for the current Luo Fan, this God Art no longer needed him to activate it. Now, even if he turned around and left, it would no longer affect the two domains recombining. Just as Luo Fan let out a breath, an inexplicable aura shrouded him. "What the hell did you do?" A slightly displeased voice entered his ears. This voice, to him, was a completely unfamiliar voice. Even if he instantly scanned the depths of his memory for any living being that could speak, he could not find the source of this voice, nor could he find the owner of this voice. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly became vigilant. He frowned and asked, "Who are you?" As he said that, the aura that had appeared out of nowhere and shrouded him shook slightly. It left his body and suddenly condensed in front of him, forming the figure of a middle-aged man. There was not a single detail on the middle-aged man's body that was not perfect. Every expression and every movement seemed to contain endless principles and mysteries. Even Luo Fan felt like the middle-aged man's imprint was about to form in the depths of his heart the moment he saw this man. Fortunately, he had experienced this imprint many times, so he had enough experience dealing with it. At this moment, an idea formed in his heart and turned into a sharp blade of wisdom. He slashed and completely destroyed the imprint that was gradually forming, causing his mind to become clear again. The middle-aged man did not care about this at all. At this moment, he only looked confused. He looked at Luo Fan and said, "Who I am is not important. What's important is, who are you? I originally thought you were only trying to benefit the independent cultivators, but now it seems that you have other plans. Tell me what you're doing." The middle-aged man did not look arrogant at all, but his expression and tone contained unimaginable pride. It was like a high and mighty god was facing a mortal that was crawling on the ground. This tone made Luo Fan frown. He said, "Sir, you must be an independent cultivator that came down from the 5th or 6th layer, right? You have such great power, and even went against the flow to come here so early, but you haven't done anything for the independent cultivators. Now you're blaming me, a person who has done a lot of things. It's ridiculous." He had absolute confidence in his guess of the middle-aged man's identity. After all, he was now an expert of the 5th tribulation who had gone through the 5th tribulation. Before he used the mysteries of the level, even an expert at the 5th layer of the Road of Tao Master would not have any advantage in front of him. He could not be like this independent cultivator in front of him, whose aura alone was enough to make him feel wary. The fact that the independent cultivator in front of him was able to do this showed that his strength was strong. No matter how one looked at it, an existence with such strength could only exist on the 5th level or higher. "Now, I'm the one asking you," the independent cultivator said indifferently. As he said this, a huge and unparalleled aura instantly shrouded Luo Fan. This aura was so mysterious that it seemed to contain the power of the world cluster. It also contained a deeper quality that belonged to the world view. Under this aura, the power of creation around Luo Fan's body began to distort wildly. Countless heavens and earth, countless worlds, countless spacetimes, infinite creatures, and infinite power crazily emerged. At every moment, there seemed to be countless cycles of life and death going on around his body. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his body and mind were under an unimaginable pressure. His life essence was rattling at this moment, as if it could no longer bear the pressure and was about to collapse to a certain extent from the inside out. Although his worldview was extremely powerful and had amazing defensive capabilities, it was much stronger than the pressure that came from the aura. However, in terms of quantity, his worldview was still too small compared to the endless aura coming from the outside world. In this way, even though his worldview was able to protect his life essence from collapsing, it was only able to protect this point. It was difficult to protect his other aspects, let alone his body itself. Sensing this unimaginably terrifying aura, Luo Fan's eyes couldn't help but light up. For him now, as long as it didn't involve the attack of a higher level, it could not really threaten his life. Although the aura of this itinerant cultivator who came from a higher level was terrifying, it ultimately did not involve the attack of a higher level. This also meant that this aura, or even this powerhouse from a higher level, posed no threat to him at all. Since there was no threat, the more techniques this powerhouse displayed, The more mysterious power he displayed, the greater the revelation it would give him, and the more benefits it would bring him. Just like Senior Sister May, who had been summoned by the fourth senior brother in the domain of the Tao Master, he had met. How was Senior Sister May back then? Didn't she also display almost overwhelming strength at the beginning? But in the end, wasn't she subdued and completely sealed by his means? Thinking of Senior Sister May, Luo Fan began to compare the itinerant cultivator in front of him. He couldn't help but be a little disappointed by this comparison. Although the itinerant cultivator in front of him was powerful, there was still a slight gap between his methods and Senior Sister May's. As expected, the disciple of the Tao Master is the disciple of the Tao Master. It's too difficult for ordinary itinerant cultivators to surpass the inheritance of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. At this moment, his body had already collapsed layer by layer under the pressure of the aura. The world group triggered by the aura frantically devoured the various parts of his body that had been crushed by the aura. It looked like layers of flesh were being scraped off his body. The scene was so tragic that it was enough to make a person with weak psychological endurance have nightmares. As expected of someone who dares to scheme against everyone, he can actually withstand this, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator said with a frown. As he said this, the aura emitted from his body became even more terrifying. The change in the aura naturally led to endless changes, causing the heaven and earth, worlds, space-time, and everything else around Luo Fan's body to suddenly expand by several times. This caused the fragments of Luo Fan's body, which had been scraped off layer by layer, to suddenly accelerate by several times. In just a few short breaths, Luo Fan, who originally had a few kilograms of flesh, had turned into a skeleton. Regardless of what your goal is, you must first open up the world group of the itinerant cultivators and let their wills return to their bodies, the middle-aged cultivator said indifferently. This voice was like a god speaking on behalf of the heavens. It directly reverberated in Luo Fan's ears, and even turned into a mysterious attack that pounced on his soul, wanting to shake his will. Where is your true body? At this moment Luo Fan spoke. As he spoke, rays of spirit light burst out from within his body and completely shattered the sound waves that were invading his body and mind. Then, it completely crushed the aura that was crushing his body like it was scraping meat, turning his body into a skeleton. At this moment, an infinite world of sound waves was born and merged with the world of sound waves, which was still spreading and connecting the domain of the rogue cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master. The speed at which the world of sound waves spread became faster and faster, and the scale also became larger and larger. The heaven and earth, worlds, space-time, and everything else that were born because of the aura were continuously crushed by the spirit light and turned back into the power of creation. They were devoured by the endless power of creation and disappeared without a trace. Chapter 2236. At this moment, the spiritual light that surged out of Luo Fan's body brazenly crushed all the worlds triggered by the aura. Then, it passed through the creation power to the middle-aged cultivator and pressed down on him. This spiritual light contained endless principles and mysteries, and its structure vaguely felt like the barrier that separated the independent cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Of course, after all, he couldn't fully understand the mysteries contained in the barrier, so the feeling of the barrier that he created at this moment was extremely superficial and belonged to a small part that he could understand. Moreover, even though it was only a small portion, he had forcefully used a power that was tens of thousands of times greater than the barrier to forcefully construct it with such a difficult method. The final effect was naturally beyond imagination. That huge and unparalleled aura seemed so fragile under the mysterious spiritual light that it was easily crushed. And the many worlds that were born because of this aura also seemed so fragile under the spiritual light, unable to resist at all. Even the projection of the cultivator in the higher realm seemed to be unable to withstand this spiritual light. That's all. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator sneered. Along with this sneer, he suddenly raised his hand and waved it in the air. A strange wave was generated out of thin air and directly swept through the terrifying spiritual light that was pressing down on him from all directions. Immediately afterward, the spiritual light collapsed and turned into countless fragments that were completely devoured by the boundless power of creation in the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. It's an attack that directly targets the structure of the barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and this thought flashed through his mind. In terms of power and power alone, that wave was tens of thousands of times weaker than the spiritual light that he released. But it was this power that was tens of thousands of times weaker than the spiritual light that he released that was directly penetrating all the defenses of his spiritual light and penetrating the most fundamental structure of the spiritual light. It forcibly disintegrated the parts of the structure that he comprehended from the barrier that made the spiritual light so powerful, causing the spiritual light to completely collapse. There was only one possibility in this situation. That was, the cultivator in front of him had studied the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain from the rogue cultivator's domain by many times more than him. So, he went against the flow to come here to study this barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a flash of inspiration, and this thought flashed through his mind. As for why the middle-aged cultivator was researching this barrier, whether it was to break it or simply for his own cultivation, he didn't even need to think about it to know the answer. The other party was definitely researching this barrier for his own cultivation. If it was for the sake of breaking this barrier with his research, he would have been able to do what Luo Fan was doing at some point in time. Not to mention, after Luo Fan constructed the long river of creation, he also had countless opportunities to sense the encounters of the many rogue cultivators in the Tao Master's domain. If he really wanted to break this barrier for the sake of the many rogue cultivators, how could he not have paid attention to them for such a long time? It wasn't until now, when Luo Fan completely disintegrated the foundation of the barrier, that the middle-aged cultivator would completely collapse with the passage of time, that the middle-aged cultivator used the experiences of the many rogue cultivators as an excuse to come to him. That's right, now, Luo Fan clearly knew that the reason that the middle-aged cultivator gave him before was just an excuse. Moreover, it was the kind of excuse that had almost no sincerity at all, and he didn't even have the intention to make Luo Fan believe it. So, what does he want to achieve? Does he want to obtain the method that I used to break this barrier? Or is he simply venting his anger, or does he have a deeper intention? All sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he couldn't help but frown slightly. At that moment, the middle-aged cultivator made his move again. He grabbed out with his hand, and the creation power in the void began to surge rapidly, as if it was being grabbed by an invisible giant hand, and began to knead in a strange manner. In the blink of an eye, a huge seal appeared in front of him. The seal wasn't huge, and it was at most the size of a person. It appeared among the creation power, and naturally produced an indescribable aura. Under this aura, the endless creation power in the surroundings was like a subject facing an emperor, and it naturally submitted. Even the way it operated began to change. From the original wanton surging in all directions, it began to circulate around the seal. In the blink of an eye, from Luo Fan's point of view, the surrounding power of creation within a huge range was gradually separated from the outside world, forming an independent and complete entity. It began to faintly reject all the power of creation from the outside world, and gradually sealed everything inside. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the domain of the Tao Master, suddenly felt that the connection between him and his doppelganger was greatly interfered with. This interference was even more powerful than the isolation between the doppelganger and the main body in the state of chaos. If he hadn't already had a higher perspective and could communicate with his doppelganger through other levels, he might have lost his doppelganger at this time, and let the doppelganger directly open up in the sealed area. What a wonderful manipulation method! As expected of an expert who came from a higher level who went against the flow. The way he used the creation power is really amazing. At this moment, both Luo Fan and his doppelganger had an inexplicable look of admiration on their faces. All along, when he entered the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, he seemed to have been successful. Whether it was the disciples of the Tao Master, the individual cultivators, or the disciples of the Tao Master who went against the flow from a higher level, they all lost to him. In fact, he had become the absolute ruler of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, whether it was the Tao Master's domain or the individual cultivator's domain. However, from the beginning until now, his manipulation of the creation power, that was, the dark chaotic power that filled the entire fourth level, had stopped at the level of letting it evolve naturally. Whether it was building his own world cluster or using the power of his own world cluster to influence the creation power, everything was in fact the result of the development of the creation power itself. From the beginning until now, he had never directly manipulated the power of creation to produce any sort of change. After all, the creation power, for the current him, was still too profound and mysterious. Even in the face of the barrier that covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path and completely separated the domain of the individual cultivators from the Tao Master's domain, he was still able to observe and comprehend its structure by constantly delving deeper and deeper. However, even though he seemed to be able to isolate the creation power at will and use it to achieve the results he wanted, he still could not understand the structure of the creation power. Whether he used a macroscopic perspective or an extremely microscopic perspective, the creation power was still the creation power. Whatever it looked like now, it would still look the same after he changed his perspective. Such a performance obviously meant that the level of his use of the creation power was still at the level of the use of the appearance. Even if he had almost used the appearance of the appearance to the point where he could easily crush all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, the appearance was still the appearance and could not become the essence, let alone allow him to manipulate and sublimate the creation power like he did with other forces and sublimate other forces. At this moment, even though the technique that the middle-aged cultivator displayed was only using the appearance of the power of creation, he had at least directly manipulated the power of creation and changed the rules of operation of the power of creation. Compared to him, it was already closer to the essence of the creation power. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not be tempted? How could he not be interested? At this moment, a faint smile appeared on the middle-aged cultivator's face, and he said, "In this case, you will no longer have any contact with the original body. Come on, let me see what secret you have to be able to surpass so many Tao Masters." As he spoke, his entire body seemed to begin to expand crazily. The originally extremely strong sense of existence began to expand crazily like a balloon. In just a few breaths, this sense of existence had increased to a level that even shocked Luo Fan. When it stabilized, Luo Fan suddenly understood. It turned out that there had never been any doppelganger projection. From the beginning, the cultivator in front of him was already the real body of the higher-level rogue cultivator. The previous state of the doppelganger projection was just a simulation of the real body using some method that he still could not understand. At this time, the size of the middle-aged cultivator was no longer the extreme sense of expansion that it gave him when he changed. It was still the same size, but it had become more solid. The original illusory state had become the state of flesh and blood. As for the aura on his body, it had also surpassed a certain limit, and had completely fused with the surrounding creation power. Although Luo Fan could still sense the boundless terror of this aura, he knew that this aura was many times stronger than when he simulated the state of the doppelganger projection. However, they did not cause any abnormalities in the surrounding creation power, nor did they cause any changes to the creation power, nor did any existences like the world clusters appear. This change made Luo Fan's heart move slightly, and he faintly had a subtle understanding. At this moment, the flow of the surrounding creation power that had been separated from the outside world began to change slightly. With this change, the flow of time inside began to accelerate crazily. In the blink of an eye, it made Luo Fan's doppelganger feel that the flow of time had increased from the same state as the original body to a terrifying degree that was billions of times faster than the original body's. In other words, a breath of time passed in the original body's place, and the time that the doppelganger had experienced would probably increase to billions of seconds. In other words, who knew how many billions of years had passed? So this is his goal. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that all of his previous questions had been answered. The middle-aged cultivator in front of him had never cared about the life and death of the independent cultivators on this level. Nor did he care about the relationship between the independent cultivators on this level and the disciples of the Tao Master. All he had ever cared about were the mysteries that interested him, or rather, the mysteries that could amaze him. And it was obvious that the mysteries that Luo Fan had displayed when he destroyed the barrier were what interested the middle-aged cultivator. Everything that the middle-aged cultivator had done was all for this moment. He wanted to control his doppelganger, and then use all means to dig out all of the doppelganger's secrets, and dig out the source of everything that he had done. After understanding all of this, he could not help but smile faintly. "I didn't expect you to have such a plan. You're indeed worthy of being an expert from a higher level." At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator was no longer in a hurry. He looked at Luo Fan and said with a smile, "You flatter me. Are you going to take the initiative to reveal all of your secrets, or do I have to dig them out myself? Don't worry, there's no need to rush. We have plenty of time now." Cutting off the connection between me and my original body, and then accelerating the flow of time, making the time it takes for my original body to rush over infinitely long. This method is not very clever. Luo Fan sighed. Whether it's clever or not, it's enough. The middle-aged cultivator's expression was still calm, and he was not angry at all because of Luo Fan's disdain for his method. However, this method of directly controlling the creation energy is quite exquisite. Can you let me know how you did it? Luo Fan stirred up the power of creation around him and asked. At this moment, the surrounding creation energy did not seem any different from before at first glance. However, if one took a closer look, they would discover that every strand of it had undergone subtle changes compared to before. The way it evolved had vaguely leaned towards various directions. It could no longer maintain absolute fairness like before, and it could evolve into any space-time, any world, and any heaven and earth. Although he did not know what was going on, Luo Fan was certain that a large portion of the creation energy in the surroundings would not be able to manifest the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time. At the very least, it was difficult to evolve the heaven and earth, world, and space-time that belonged to the world of laws. The middle-aged cultivator looked at Luo Fan with a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You can still ask this calmly at a time like this. No wonder you have such strength at this stage." Luo Fan smiled and said, "It's not just me. Almost all the cultivators who can reach the 4th level have the same mentality." The middle-aged cultivator sneered and shook his head. "You've overestimated them. If they had this mentality, how could they have stayed on this level for such a long time without making any progress? No creation energy? That's not a reason at all. Even at the beginning, there was creation energy appearing at every moment in the rogue cultivator's territory. If they had the intention, they would have long researched a way to penetrate the barrier and communicate with the Tao Venerable's territories. But look at what they've done. They've stuck to their old ways. They've actually surrounded the source of creation energy and supervised each other so that no one can affect the source. If it weren't for you, would there be any difference between them now and before?" Luo Fan remained silent for a while. Indeed, although the middle-aged cultivator was a little extreme, His words were not too wrong. Even before he arrived, the rogue cultivator's territory also had a considerable number of sources of creation energy. Although these sources were small, they were still connected to the Tao Venerable's territories. If they were really bold, they could have used their own wisdom, power, or even the wisdom and power of many fellow Taoists to research and experiment on the source. Perhaps they could have done what Luo Fan had done countless years before Luo Fan arrived, expanding the source of creation energy and increasing the amount of creation energy that surged in by countless times. In the end, they could have changed the empty and lonely state of the rogue cultivator's territory. However, until Luo Fan arrived, the rogue cultivator's territory remained in the same state as when the barrier was first set up. There was a huge gap between the rogue cultivator's territory and the Tao Venerable's territories. Was it really just a problem with the Tao Venerable's territories? Were there really no problems with those rogue cultivators at all? The middle-aged cultivator's expression relaxed when he saw Luo Fan's silence. He smiled and said, "It's precisely because I've seen through them that I've never thought of helping them break the barrier, even though I've already figured out how to break it." Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed. "Why do you have to make it sound so noble? It's just that you haven't fully understood the mystery of the barrier, so you don't want it to disappear. How can there be so many reasons?" The middle-aged man's expression froze for a moment before he smiled and said, "That's naturally part of the reason. However, the reason I mentioned is also one of my considerations." Chapter 2237. The middle-aged man sneered. He didn't make any movements, but the surrounding creation power under his control had already begun to riot. A seal condensed from the power of creation appeared in front of him. Then, it suddenly moved, as if it was an incomparably vast world. Accompanied by boundless momentum, it crazily pressed towards Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that everything about his clone in reality, whether it was his mind or consciousness, perception or instinct, and even his body, power, and everything else, was suppressed by an unimaginable power. At this moment, Luo Fan could only watch helplessly as the seal imprinted itself on his body. The speed of the seal had reached an unimaginable level. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived above his head and pressed down on it. Boom! With a loud sound, an earth-shattering explosion came from Luo Fan's body. Amidst the explosion, surging airwaves gushed out from the pores all over his body, directly causing the surrounding Genesis energy to become chaotic. If it was in the outside world, such an impact would be enough to make the surrounding creation power give birth to countless worlds, and spacetime. But here, where the middle-aged cultivator was completely controlling, such an impact did not have any effect. The creation power was still the creation power, and its nature did not change at all. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that everything inside his body was constantly undergoing earth-shattering explosions. This kind of explosion was so intense that it felt like every inch of his body was enough to completely tear his entire body apart. However, in the end, the power of the explosion did not leak out at all. It only messed up the insides of his body, causing his insides to gradually turn into a mass of chaos. However, it did not cause any changes to his body at all. It was as if there was an even more powerful force binding the surface of his body during the process of the earth-shattering explosion, maintaining his body from collapsing. At this moment, a misty feeling rose from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. The light and shadow in front of him constantly changed, twisting into various abstract landscapes that could not be described with words. "You want to confuse my mind?" At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on through the senses of his main body outside. At this moment, his main body could clearly see through the connection on other levels that in the independent domain of creation power created by the middle-aged cultivator, the seal was releasing infinite power and stirring up all the structures in his body. Whether it was the structure of spacetime, the structure of consciousness, the structure of the soul, or even the essence of his life, they were all shaken by the impact like catkins in the wind. At the same time, as his body was in chaos, a kind of mysterious, indistinct power wrapped around his origin of life. It continued to outline and build around his origin of life, as if it wanted to form an incomparably profound structure to achieve some purpose. Combined with the senses of his doppelganger, he could clearly know that the source of the power that made him fall into confusion and isolated him from the surroundings came from the mysterious structure that wrapped around his life origin. In that structure, Luo Fan could sense an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Among them, there was a bit of the aura that belonged to the barrier that isolated the domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master. Of course, compared to the barrier, this layer of structure lacked that kind of natural feeling and had a lot more smoke and fire. If the real barrier was said to be the naturally born stars in the universe, then the structure in front of him was just like the starry sky drawn by a naughty child on a piece of paper. The disparity between the two was unimaginably large. However, it was precisely because of such a huge gap that Luo Fan finally felt as if he was facing the real barrier, and had no way to comprehend its mystery. In the face of this structure that was constantly being built, he finally grasped its traces and found the thread to comprehend its fundamental mystery. I see. This barrier actually contains so many mysteries. Not only does it contain the mystery of the fourth layer of the world group, but it also contains the essence of the third layer of the Tao Foundation, the characteristics of the many strange scenes in the second layer, the vastness of the grand rules of heaven and earth in the first layer, and even a variety of exquisite principles that are unknown to the higher-level people. It really is all-inclusive and contains everything. Taking advantage of the opportunity of the rapid creation of the structure, Luo Fan tried his best to absorb its secrets and understand the many principles contained in it. The structure contained almost all the mysteries that Luo Fan had previously comprehended in the Tao Master's path, whether it was the first, second, third, or fourth layer. Moreover, this inclusion was not a simple stacking. Instead, it was ingeniously combined in an unimaginable and mysterious way. Layer upon layer, place upon place. Every mystery was in the most suitable and needed position. In the end, it formed an incomparably complete and could even be called a perfect whole. Of course, this combination could be said to be truly perfect on the barrier. It was so perfect that Luo Fan could not find any traces of it, or even to the extent that he could not discover its combination at all. However, in front of him, the structure that was constantly outlined and constructed around the life origin of the doppelganger was still very far from being perfect. The combination of the various principles and mysteries was still very artificial, so Luo Fan only needed to sense it slightly to distinguish each of them. Although Luo Fan dared not say that he had surpassed all cultivators with his understanding of the previous few layers and the fourth layer, at least in the same layer, he was at least confident that no one could compare to him. Previously, when he did not know the foundation of the barrier, because he could not find the direction to comprehend it, he naturally could not understand the structure of the barrier. However, after being reminded by the other party and knowing the direction, he felt like he had opened the door to a new world. He only felt endless inspiration and endless information crazily pouring into his heart, making him feel that his understanding of the barrier was deepening at every moment, and he felt that his understanding of the mysterious principles of the previous layers was becoming more profound. After just a short while, he had absolute confidence that he could release a spiritual light that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than before. It must be said that the spiritual light that contained the mysteries of the barrier was something that he had expended a lot of effort to comprehend. He had relied on his near-limitlessly deep understanding of the microscopic world to slightly comprehend it. Now, with just this single comprehension, he had already surpassed all of his previous comprehensions by who knew how much. It was evident how great his progress was. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body actually still existed in the domain of the Tao Lord, and he was still within his own world cluster. He did not rush toward the location of the doppelganger as the middle-aged cultivator thought he would. However, this was extremely convenient for what he wanted to do now. At this moment, he swept his gaze and instantly locked onto a certain part of the void. As his perspective rapidly changed, that part of the void was constantly magnified, and the secret hidden in the depths of the void was gradually revealed. In the end, after magnifying it by who knows how many billions of times, he finally saw the secret hidden behind the void. It was a barrier that filled the entire domain of the Tao Lord and completely separated the domain of the independent cultivators. It was a barrier that was set up by the powerhouses under the tutelage of the Tao Lord of a higher level. Fortunately, he was in his own world cluster and not somewhere else, where he was surrounded by the boundless creation energy. If he wanted to do this while he was surrounded by the creation energy, he would have to first get rid of the huge interference of the creation energy before he could truly see the barrier. And this would require at least a large amount of his energy. At this moment, the barrier was rapidly collapsing. The location of the collapse was where his doppelganger was, which was also the source of the long river of creation, and also the location of the passageway that connected to the ball of power on his palm. If one were to think about it logically, the location of the barrier should correspond to where Luo Fan was at this moment, which was also the interior of his world cluster. However, it was clear that the creation energy could not be deduced with logic that ordinary living beings could understand. At this moment, the location where the barrier was broken was not where Luo Fan was, but outside his world cluster. In fact, it was in a very ordinary part of the void outside the incomparably huge vortex of creation energy around Luo Fan's world cluster. It was as if the passageway that was surging with the creation energy was not the same as the passageway that was created when the barrier was broken, even though the place where the barrier was broken seemed to be formed after the passageway collapsed and spread. At this moment, if Luo Fan looked out, he would see that in a place extremely far away from the vortex of creation energy that was filled with tens of millions of worlds, endless strands of strange power that were fused with the creation energy were constantly gathering somewhere. And as the power gathered, the passageway that led to the independent cultivator's domain also constantly fused, creating an increasingly large passageway that connected to the independent cultivator's domain. With the birth of the passageway, endless creation energy continuously poured into the independent cultivator's domain through the passageway, causing the concentration of the creation energy in the independent cultivator's domain to become thicker and thicker as time passed. It also caused the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain to start thinning with the passageway as the center. Although because it had only appeared for a short time, the concentration of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain did not decrease too much, and the rate of decrease was not too fast, it was still decreasing bit by bit. If any of the Tao Master's disciples discovered this at this time, they would definitely hate Luo Fan to the core. However, it was clear that all the disciples of the Tao Masters had been pulled into his own world group and were thrown into the various worlds and spacetimes to contribute to the evolution of his world group. But how could there be any Tao Masters disciples who could discover this? As for whether this would happen or not, it was needless to say. If the concentration of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain would not be affected by the dispersion of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain, why did the high-level Tao Master's disciples separate the two back then? Why did they condense the creation energy that was originally in the independent cultivator's domain into the Tao Master's domain? Of course, it was because if it was dispersed, the concentration would be reduced too much, and the efficiency of cultivation would be lower. That was why they had paid a huge price to do so. Otherwise, did they do all this just to show off their outstanding skills? How could an existence who had cultivated to such a high level be so bored? At this time, Luo Fan did not care much about the outside world, or even his doppelganger. At this time, he just concentrated on comprehending the barrier in front of him at this moment, comprehending the combination of the layers of mysteries contained in it, and the organic use of the layers of mysteries. He tried his best to comprehend the mysteries contained in it, but they were not as profound as the previous few levels of the Tao Master's path that he had understood before. Compared to before, when he could not find a way at all, now it was as if he had found the key. Really, whatever he comprehended, the barrier that was originally so complicated that it could not be seen clearly was becoming clearer every moment, and he even felt that his understanding of the mysteries had further deepened every moment. From time to time, he would let out such an exclamation, "It turns out that this kind of principle can produce such changes. It turns out that the combination of these two principles can actually produce such an effect." As he exclaimed, he felt that there was a faint flash of spiritual light around his body, and layers of barriers appeared around his body out of thin air before quickly dissipating into thin air. Just like that, the cycle continued without end. Every time the barrier appeared, there would be some improvement compared to the previous one. The structure of the barrier became more complex and mysterious. Unknowingly, after trillions of barriers had been created and destroyed, the barrier that appeared around Luo Fan's body once again was shining, exuding an extremely strong aura that belonged to the world of laws. It existed around his body, and it felt as if countless worlds of laws were stacked together and completely wrapped around him, exuding a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. However, even so, when he added something to it, it still couldn't withstand it. Once again, it collapsed, just like the trillions of times it had done before. Chapter 2238. Through his deep understanding of the barrier, Luo Fan was sure that in addition to the mystery of the fourth level of the Tao Master that he had already comprehended, there were four more profound, more complicated, and more difficult to understand mysteries. If there was a mystery of the first level of the Tao Master's path, then, by preliminary calculation, the disciple of the Tao Master who built the barrier should have mastered at least 8 different mysteries. That was to say, if there was no fundamental change in the reason, then the disciple of the Tao Master should at least have reached the 8th level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, he had already reached that level hundreds of millions of years ago. After all, this barrier was built hundreds of millions of years ago. Luo Fan floated in the void, a trace of shock flashing through his eyes. In a trance, he seemed to see an incomparably huge figure that filled the heaven and earth and shrouded all the heavens and realms above his head, covering all the heaven and earth that he could see. "I didn't expect it to be the existence of the 8th level," he murmured, but gradually, an indescribable excitement and fighting spirit emerged in his eyes. Although he was confident, he would never lose his self-awareness. Compared to almost all the disciples of the Tao Masters he had met, he was already ahead of them. Even if it was the disciple of the 5th level of the Tao Master, he was confident enough to defeat them. However, it did not mean that he would be arrogant enough to think that he could be invincible under the true divine level. It did not mean that he really thought that he could defeat the experts at the 8th level of the Tao Master's path. At least, for the current him, the disciples of the 8th level of the Tao Master's path were still in a position that was almost impossible to resist. If such an existence really wanted to deal with him, he was afraid that the other party's understanding of the mysteries of the level was not deep enough to completely erase him. However, even though he knew that such an existence was much stronger than him, Luo Fan was not discouraged because of this. He thought that he should obey the wishes of the expert and not even dare to challenge him. On the contrary, because of the strength of the existence, his fighting spirit soared, and he was excited to see the means of the existence at that level. "Let me see how profound the skills of a Tao Master at the 8th level are," he murmured. His eyes focused, and his spirit was even more focused on the barrier. He tried even harder to dig out the deeper mysteries of the barrier. He wanted to dig out the various subtle and complicated principles of the higher levels that were revealed. The mysteries of each level of the Tao Master's path were extremely complicated. If there was no corresponding environment, it would be at least tens of thousands of times more difficult to comprehend the mysteries than if there was an appropriate environment. Otherwise, why would those true sages open up such a huge road to become a Tao master? Even if a true sage was omnipotent, his power and might shouldn't be squandered like this. Therefore, at this time, if Luo Fan wanted to comprehend the mysteries of the barrier in advance, and even the mysteries that had been transformed by the expert and had a deep connection with the other levels, it could be imagined how difficult it was. Even though he tried his best to dig deeper and comprehend with all his might, after over 3 million years, he was only able to gain a deeper understanding of the various mysteries of the fourth, third, second, and first level. He was still completely clueless about the mystery of the fifth level. In fact, he did not even know which of the remaining 4 mysteries it was. What a pity! In the end, he could only sigh and stop this almost futile effort. After more than 3 million years of effort, the barrier formed by the spiritual light around his body had become extremely stable. It didn't look as obvious as before, but it was faintly discernible. At first glance, it was just a faint layer of fluorescence covering the surface of his body. Only by careful observation and careful discrimination could one see that the fluorescence was mixed with endless runes and lines, which contained infinite profound principles and mysteries. This structure was naturally much weaker than the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain and the rogue cultivator's domain, but compared to the barrier that he could condense at will, it was not much weaker. As for the barrier that was constructed by the middle-aged cultivator who was now imprisoning his doppelganger in the domain of creation power, it was at least 100 times stronger. Because the doppelganger and the original body could be connected through other levels, from the beginning, the time flow between Luo Fan's doppelganger and the original body was already the same. In other words, at this moment, his original body had experienced more than 3 million years outside, and the doppelganger had only stayed in the domain of creation power where time was extremely accelerated for more than 3 million years. However, as the middle-aged cultivator had expected, who knows how many billions of trillions of years had passed. 3 million years might be extremely long in the eyes of ordinary living beings, but for an existence like Luo Fan, it was not much different from the blink of an eye. The middle-aged cultivator would not think that 3 million years was long. In fact, even though more than 3 million years had passed, he was still suppressing Luo Fan's doppelganger and building a barrier around the doppelganger's origin of life that was similar to the barrier that separated the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. Compared to more than 3 million years ago, this structure was naturally countless times more complicated and perfect. At this moment, there were countless runes and lines around the doppelganger's origin of life. These runes and lines were formed by the condensation of the most mysterious rays of light. They contained infinite power, and even the power of the world group was only an extremely basic and ordinary part of it. The countless runes and lines had already formed a complete system. Although it still had a strong sense of existence, compared to before, it no longer felt broken, and there was a sense of perfection. Obviously, the construction of the barrier had already reached the final moment. Next, the barrier would most likely be completed at any time. In fact, the reason why Luo Fan stopped comprehending the barrier at this time was not only because he found it difficult to find any more gains, but also because his avatar was about to be completely sealed. This was also one of the important reasons. It must be known that the middle-aged cultivator was an expert from the 5th level or even higher. It went without saying that such an existence's methods were brilliant. Although it seemed that there would not be any impact now, who knew what methods the other party would use to dig out his secrets after his origin of life was completely sealed? Even if he wanted to see what methods the other party had, he would not hand over his fundamental secrets to the other party and let the other party use them. In other words, at this moment, what he needed to do was to stop the other party. The middle-aged cultivator was no different from how he was 3 million years ago. Even his willpower, emotions, and attitude had not changed. He was still as passionate as before. It was as if the past 3 million years didn't leave a trace in his heart at all. "Come on, hand over your secrets," he muttered as he raised his hand and pointed at the seal that smashed into the head of Luo Fan's clone. As he pointed, rays of light began to flicker madly from the seal. All kinds of invisible power penetrated the body of Luo Fan's avatar and rushed towards his soul and life source. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved, and the clone suddenly took action without any warning. At this moment, countless sharp blades emerged from his origin of life and cut into the barrier that was constantly being constructed around him. If the barrier was truly complete or even perfect, it would naturally be flawless. The sharp blades formed from the power of the world would naturally not be able to cut into it. But it was a pity that the barrier was not flawless at this moment. Among them, there were still some tiny loopholes, or rather, flaws. These loopholes and flaws were naturally nothing under normal circumstances. As soon as the barrier circulated, they would naturally be covered up. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan had already discovered these loopholes and flaws, they were clearly fatal. At this moment, the hunters forcibly cut into the structure and directly blocked it, causing the structure that was originally only one step away from flawless to instantly stop functioning. Many of the originally unstable structures began to rapidly collapse, and the originally tiny loopholes and flaws began to rapidly increase and increase. At this moment, the runes and lines that the middle-aged cultivator had thrown over to complete the structure were like a boulder that had been placed on a fragile frame. In an instant, the structure exploded with a loud bang. Countless fragments directly tore apart Luo Fan's body, and the seal that was originally on his head completely collapsed. How is this possible? At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator's eyes were filled with intense disbelief. It was rare for him to lose control of himself like this and say such words. But this was not his fault. In fact, if other cultivators had seen everything that had happened, they might not have simply lost control of themselves. Their worldview might have been overturned, and they might even suffer from chi deviation. Luo Fan did not know, but the middle-aged cultivator could not be more clear about this. This barrier had been around for countless trillions of years since it had been created. There were countless cultivators who had comprehended this barrier. Among them, there was no lack of powerhouses who were of a higher level than him. However, among so many powerhouses, none of them could comprehend even a trace of the mysteries of this barrier in a shorter time than him. It was precisely because the difficulty of comprehending this barrier was simply too great that he was the only one who could feel a sense of accomplishment from this barrier and still stayed on the fourth level to comprehend this barrier. At this moment, this individual who had clearly just ascended to the fourth level and had not even stayed here for more than 100 million years had actually obtained benefits from the barrier. In fact, he had even thoroughly comprehended the comprehension that he had obtained after spending trillions of years to break the divine ability that he had constructed based on the barrier. This situation simply showed that this rogue cultivator's comprehension was stronger than any other expert he had seen before. How could he not be shocked? How could he not lose control of himself? Naturally, Luo Fan was not in the mood to understand the middle-aged cultivator's loss of control at this moment. At this moment, everything inside and outside of his body had disappeared except for the origin of life. If he wanted to continue fighting, he obviously could not do so in this state. Therefore, at this moment, he circulated his origin of life and created endless power and matter out of thin air. He quickly formed the outline, and in the blink of an eye, his body, divine soul, power, and the space-time in his body had been completely constructed. Moreover, this construction vaguely coincided with the mysterious structure that he had comprehended from the barrier. As this structure was constructed, he felt that the influence of the creation force on him had weakened unprecedentedly. In the past, if he wanted to establish a foothold in the creation force, he would need to use the power protection that he had obtained from his own cluster of world. But now, with this structure, he no longer needed to guide any power to gather on his body. Just by relying on his own body and the circulation of his own power, he could easily resist the creation force. Facing the boundless pitch-black power, no matter how the power struck him, he remained unmoved and unscathed. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator just came back to his senses and saw the process of the birth of Luo Fan's body. He murmured, and the shock in his eyes became even more intense. Then, he thought of something, and his eyes flashed with an even more intense light. Is this because of the secret that he possesses? That must be it. This secret can actually give him such a powerful comprehension. If I obtain it, won't I be able to instantly comprehend all the mysteries of the barrier and no longer need to stay on this level? With this thought, the gaze that he looked at Luo Fan's clone became even more scorching. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed. As expected, you still haven't given up. You should know that the better you perform, the more interested I am in your secret. The middle-aged cultivator sneered. As he spoke, the Genesis energy that was under his control began to stir. Compared to before, there was an indescribable change in the way it circulated. It was self-sufficient, self-contained, and the feeling of being completely isolated from the outside world became even more intense. Sensing this change, Luo Fan instantly understood what the other party was doing. You think that I had a way to contact my main body just now? The middle-aged cultivator said indifferently, Of course, apart from this possibility, there is no other way that you can retaliate against me. That's not necessarily true. How do you know that I didn't rely on the so-called secret that you mentioned to do all of this? Luo Fan smiled faintly. As he spoke, he casually waved his hand, and the creation force around him began to fall into silence. The silence here formed a strong contrast with the rapid turbulence of the creation force outside, causing an extremely obvious mark to form at the border between the two, as if there was a scratch that completely separated the two sides. The middle-aged cultivator's eyes lit up. This method of controlling the creation force had clearly grasped some of the true essence of the barrier. Even if it was him, it would not be easy for him to achieve this step. He might need to spend dozens of breaths of time before he could do it. Compared to Luo Fan, who was able to do it in an instant, it was clearly a little inferior. But even so, the middle-aged cultivator did not show any signs of backing down. Instead, he remained strong, and the light in his eyes became even more intense and scorching. What a secret that I yearned for! Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, Luo Fan turned his right hand slightly, clenched it into a fist, and threw it at the middle-aged cultivator from afar. Luo Fan's body didn't seem to have much power or effect from this attack. However, the creation force in the outside world underwent an earth-shattering change under this punch. In a trance, the creation force began to transform rapidly, turning into layers of light that combined into a huge fist. It directly broke through the air and arrived in front of the middle-aged cultivator, completely enveloping his body. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator felt as if his body was tightly bound by some incomparably terrifying power. Even the circulation of his power seemed to have stagnated, and every thought in his mind seemed to require more energy. This punch condensed the infinite mysteries of the fourth, third, second, and first levels of the Tao Master's path that Luo Fan had walked through. They were combined together in an organic way, complementing each other, promoting each other, and finally achieving the effect of mutual sublimation. This made their combined power tens of thousands of times stronger than their individual power. If Senior Sister May had appeared in front of this fist, she would have been completely defeated by this fist without any resistance. She would not even have had the time to escape with the help of the Tao Master's prison. In the face of such an attack, the middle-aged cultivator simply shouted. Then, without going through any process, his palm appeared in front of the fist out of thin air. Without any hesitation, he lightly patted the fist. In the blink of an eye, a boundless, terrifying power was injected into the fist, causing it to suddenly collapse like it was made of smoke. It turned into wisps of mist and disappeared without a trace. Although you've already done everything you can, you've done your best. However, the gap between our realms is something you can't resist. The middle-aged cultivator shouted. Chapter 2239. As he spoke, a ray of light suddenly appeared on the middle-aged cultivator's body. This ray of light was vivid and lifelike, as if it was a real living thing. In the blink of an eye, it condensed above his head. It seemed to have eyebrows and eyes, and one could even faintly hear an extremely strange language coming from it. After this ray of light appeared, Luo Fan felt as if he was being stared at by something. He felt as if there was a sharp blade on his back. At this moment, the ray of light seemed to be wriggling extremely slowly, changing into all sorts of strange forms. At times, it condensed into a number of legs, and at other times, it condensed into a number of wings. At other times, it turned into a strange head, and at other times, it displayed a strange figure. The various forms were almost at the limit of the imagination of living beings. According to the understanding of time for ordinary living beings, these strange changes would probably take many years to complete. However, at this moment, the ray of light displayed so many complicated changes from beginning to end, and in the end, it did not even take any time. Even though Luo Fan had seen every detail of its changes from beginning to end, in the end, he still found that the time was basically the same as before. The entire process of the light's changes did not seem to take any time at all. When such a contradictory feeling appeared, Luo Fan's expression changed greatly, and he became extremely solemn. This was because he knew very well that the appearance of this feeling meant that the ray of light before him had the ability to distort his perception of time. He couldn't be any clearer about this. For example, when one said a long sentence to an enemy, but one's opponent could hear every word of this sentence extremely clearly in an instant. For example, a punch that was originally extremely fast, but in the end, the opponent could see it clearly and recognize every detail of this punch. And so on. He had done such things too many times. And in order to achieve all of this, Luo Fan was extremely clear about the goal that had to be achieved. This was something that could only be achieved when one's control of time was far superior to the opponent's, or even reached the point where it could affect or even control the opponent's perception of time. In other words, the fact that this ray of light could make him feel so contradictory meant that at least in terms of time, it was superior to him. How could he not be serious when he understood this? This is one of the 4 mysteries that I haven't comprehended yet. After a moment of solemnity, he quickly came to a conclusion, and his eyes began to shine with a probing light. The changes produced by the light before him were so subtle and mysterious that even Luo Fan couldn't understand them. However, after comparing it with the various principles within the barrier, he discovered that one of the 8 types of mysterious principles within the barrier was somewhat similar to the feeling emitted by the light in front of him. After confirming this, he naturally understood what the middle-aged cultivator meant by the difference in cultivation level. Using a profound mystery that surpasses the 4th level to deal with me? Then let me see what kind of power this profound mystery has. With that in mind, he focused his mind and raised his hand to grab at the void. A 3-legged cauldron appeared in front of him. At first glance, this 3-legged cauldron looked exactly the same as the one he used to deal with Senior Sister May. But if one looked carefully, one would notice that the scene inside the 3-legged cauldron was completely different from before. Back then, the interior of the 3-legged cauldron was just a chaotic scene of countless lights and shadows mixed together. But now, the interior of the 3-legged cauldron was a boundless void. It was just like the void in the rogue cultivator's domain at the very beginning. If one's perception was just a little sharper and observation ability was just a little stronger, one would even be able to see the indescribable barrier that filled every corner of the void and enveloped the entire void. That barrier seemed to be somewhat similar to the barrier that separated the rogue cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Of course, compared to the calm and stable barrier between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain, the barrier in the depths of the three-legged cauldron was extremely active, and there were billions of changes occurring within it at every moment. And every change seemed to be brewing unimaginable power at the same time, as if any one of them was enough to completely crush a world group. At this moment, the light above the middle-aged cultivator's head that seemed to be alive slightly froze. A chirping sound came from it. Then, Luo Fan felt that his body was restricted by some indescribable mysterious power. This mysterious power was different from any power that he had ever known. Whether it was the power of the world group, the power of concept, or even the power of worldview, they were all fundamentally different from this mysterious power. Goodbye. I originally wanted to keep your consciousness, but now it seems that it's better for your consciousness to be erased. Anyway, I only want your memory. The middle-aged cultivator seemed to look at Luo Fan with pity and said so. Before Luo Fan could react, that incomparably mysterious power had already moved slightly. With this movement, all the internal structures of Luo Fan's body began to collapse, whether it was his body or his power, whether it was the space-time within his body, his soul, or even his life source and life essence. In the blink of an eye, he felt a sense of dizziness, and a feeling of dying arose spontaneously. In a trance, he felt as if he had entered the abyss of death. At this moment, he clearly saw what changes had happened to his clone through his main body. He saw that the mysterious power had seeped into everything inside his body, and with a sudden force, it completely shattered his body, causing his existence in this plane of reality to completely lose its original structure. His entire body directly turned into a cloud of indistinguishable smoke, and his will turned into endless light that mixed with the smoke. It was further worn down by the power, and bits and pieces of it were continuously extinguished. At this moment, an indescribable power descended from nowhere and began to move towards the middle-aged cultivator. Sensing this power, the middle-aged cultivator's expression changed. The light above his head that seemed like a living thing emitted an unwilling emotion, and with a slight tremble, it collapsed and disappeared. As the light disappeared, the power that descended out of nowhere disappeared after a moment of confusion. It was as if he had suddenly lost the target that he was supposed to descend upon. I was almost discovered by the Tao Lord's prison. Sensing that the power had disappeared, the middle-aged cultivator heaved a sigh of relief. The power that suddenly descended was none other than the power of the Tao Lord's prison. And the reason why this power had descended was because he had used that light before. That light was actually a method that he had extracted from the mysteries of the fourth level of the Tao Lord's path. This method had already exceeded the limits of the fourth level. Once it was used, it would naturally trigger the Tao Master's purgatory, allowing the Tao Master's purgatory to confirm his identity and know that he had gone against the flow. Naturally, a power would descend to drag him into the Tao Master's purgatory to suppress him. It was precisely because of this drawback that he had not used this method before, and had only used the barrier to conceal it to indirectly use the various things he had comprehended in the higher levels. But this is enough. So what if I use the mysteries of the lower levels to create a flower? The gap between levels is not so easy to overcome, the middle-aged cultivator said indifferently. As he spoke, he raised his hand and grabbed at the cloud of smoke that Luo Fan had turned into. With this grab, an invisible force entered the cloud of smoke and began to search for the nearly indestructible memories hidden within. You clearly know that my main body has a way to contact my avatar, so why do you still think that you can truly subdue me by just dealing with this avatar? At this moment, Luo Fan's voice came from the smoke. This voice immediately made the middle-aged cultivator frown. Just now, Luo Fan's avatar had indeed been completely dealt with. If it wasn't for his main body constantly paying attention to the avatar through other levels and regathering the avatar's consciousness when it was destroyed, the avatar might really have been completely destroyed, and its memories would have been completely taken by the middle-aged cultivator. Unfortunately, this kind of if did not exist. After the avatar's consciousness was obliterated, his main body immediately regathered that consciousness, allowing that consciousness to regain control of his shattered body and everything else. Although he still endured the constant destruction of the mysterious power during this process and had to resist the power's erosion of his consciousness at all times, in the end, he was still able to control his memories. He was able to make it so that anyone who wanted to take his memories would first have to completely destroy his consciousness. As a result, the middle-aged cultivator's original plan was completely thwarted. I originally planned to let your main body live, but it seems that won't be possible now. After a while, the middle-aged cultivator sighed with a somewhat pitiful expression and a hint of killing intent. That's not up to you. Luo Fan sighed. With this, the middle-aged cultivator's expression suddenly changed. Because at this moment, he suddenly felt that the domain of creation power that he had originally constructed to imprison Luo Fan's clone, which was completely isolated from the outside world, had been reversed at this moment. The domain that was originally used to imprison his opponent had now become the one that was imprisoning him. "What did you do?" he shouted softly. Following his words, the surrounding creation power that was independent from the outside world began to riot. All kinds of lights were born and frantically rushed out. Just as those rays of light were about to charge out of the domain and step into the boundless power of creation outside, a subtle barrier appeared before them, completely blocking their path. It was the same no matter which direction they were in. During this process of obstruction, an extremely violent riot clearly appeared on the barrier and was born in front of the light. However, even Luo Fan and the middle-aged cultivator did not feel any sound coming from within their bodies. Just by listening to the sound, one would not even think that this collision was very intense. One could only imagine how terrifying the impact was by looking at the various terrifying fluctuations that were released and the creation and destruction of the universe, worlds, and space-time that were created and destroyed by the fluctuations. It must be known that even the most intense exchange of moves between Luo Fan and the middle-aged cultivator and the change in the creation power was far less than 1/10,000th of the change in the creation power around the barrier. It went without saying how terrifying this impact was. I still have to thank you for your reminder. If you hadn't demonstrated that method, I wouldn't have been able to control this barrier to this extent. At this moment, Luo Fan's voice rang in the middle-aged cultivator's ears. Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator's expression darkened. How many times had this been? Every time he displayed a method that was enough to subdue his opponent, it did not take long for the opponent to say that he had advanced a step with his help. Whether this was true or not, it was enough to make him feel extremely displeased. If you haven't entered that level, no matter how you comprehend it, it's all specious, he said coldly. As he spoke, the light that was derived from the creation power around him increased by thousands of times. As the light surged, he revealed a strenuous expression. His entire body was trembling, and his face had turned indescribably pale. Sweat continuously seeped out of his pores. By the time the boundless power of creation had turned into light, even his aura had begun to weaken. It was as if in order to support this change, even his origin had been greatly consumed. With this change, whether it was to the outside or inside, the pressure that the light emitted had increased by countless times. Under the pressure of the light, Luo Fan's clone in the domain had been forcibly compressed into a small dot. A small dot that couldn't even be measured by size. Even this small dot was still enduring the boundless and terrifying pressure at this moment. The entire dot trembled from time to time, and there seemed to be even more powerful pressure constantly invading the depths of this small dot, trying to completely disintegrate the internal structure of this small dot. The pressure inside was already so terrifying, so there was no need to mention the pressure on the outside, which the light originally targeted, the barrier. Under the impact of the light, the barrier outside began to shake constantly. Cracks began to appear on the barrier. At first, these cracks were only small marks, and if one didn't look carefully, they might even be completely ignored. But as time passed, as the light increased, the cracks became more and more obvious, and the cracks grew larger and larger. In the end, under Luo Fan's inexplicable gaze, the barrier finally collapsed completely. However, after it collapsed, it didn't completely turn into countless fragments like ordinary things would when they collapse. Instead, it unfolded in an extremely strange manner, turning back into a flat surface and disappearing without a trace in a flash. This was because the barrier itself wasn't actually constructed by Luo Fan. Instead, he used a method that he comprehended from the method that the middle-aged cultivator used to curl up the part of the barrier that still existed between the two domains into a sphere, and then transferred it to the surroundings to envelop the portion of the creation power that the middle-aged cultivator controlled. In this way, there was naturally a difference between the nature of the barrier and the power that condensed the barrier into a sphere. Even if Luo Fan completely concealed this difference and tried to make it as small as possible, he couldn't really make it disappear. Therefore, under the pressure of the light transformed by the infinite creation power, the barrier itself wasn't damaged at all, but the power that shifted and distorted the barrier into a sphere couldn't withstand it and was directly destroyed. It was precisely because of this that after the spherical barrier was destroyed, it didn't shatter into countless fragments. Instead, it unfolded into a flat surface and instantly disappeared without a trace. The moment the barrier was broken, the light began to converge, and in the blink of an eye, it had already converged above his head, forming an ever-changing, lifelike form. Impressively, it was the same form that had easily crushed Luo Fan's clone. As the light converged, the middle-aged cultivator's incomparable fatigue, which was as if his origin had been consumed, began to gradually fade, and his expression and aura began to recover rapidly. All of this seemed rather complicated, but in fact the entire process took an extremely short time. From the birth of the light until it broke through the barrier and converged above his head, less than a breath of time had passed. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator looked up and found that almost 1/10 of the rogue cultivator's domain had been connected with the Tao Master's domain. In other words, 1/10 of the rogue cultivator's domain had been retracted into the Tao Master's domain and reintegrated with the domain of the Tao Master. The timing isn't right. He frowned, and this thought flashed through his mind. According to his original thought, he had spent more than 3 million years in the independent domain that he had created, and it should only have been a few breaths outside. With this distance, the cultivator wouldn't have advanced too much in destroying the barrier. Even if he could see that the damage had increased, it shouldn't be too obvious. Chapter 2240. Depending on the size of the secret, one's feelings would be greatly different. For example, to an ordinary wealthy person in the mortal world, if another person possessed a treasure that could extend one's lifespan, then he would definitely be filled with greed, and he would absolutely desire to possess such a treasure. However, if that person suddenly turned into an immortal and held an immortal's magic treasure in his hand, then the rich man would only feel fear. Previously, in the eyes of the middle-aged cultivator, the secret that Luo Fan possessed was like a treasure that could extend one's lifespan in the hands of an ordinary person. Of course, the only thing that would appear in his heart would be greed. But now, after discovering that the connection between Luo Fan's main body and his doppelganger was so close that it toppled his worldview, this secret had become as terrifying as a magic treasure in the hands of an immortal. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator felt the urge to retreat for the first time. Perhaps this person's secret is not something that I can pry into. This thought involuntarily emerged in his heart, causing his movements to become slightly sluggish. At this moment, he suddenly frowned. The miraculous light that had already gathered around his body began to converge, directly merging into his body. He looked no different from how he was at the beginning, and one could not even sense any special power from his body. It was as if in the blink of an eye, he had turned from a supreme expert who could destroy the heavens and earth into an ordinary middle-aged man who did not even have the strength to truss a chicken. After doing this, he heaved a sigh of relief and looked in a certain direction. He saw that somewhere in the Tao Master's domain, the endless power of the Tao Master's prison was constantly surging and gathering in that direction like waves. It felt as if it was going to completely break through that location and drown everything hidden within it. Just at this moment, a thunderous sound erupted from that location. A light that contained endless power surged out from it, tearing apart the Genesis energy, tearing apart the void, and tearing apart the plane of reality. This light was so terrifying that it was countless times more powerful and terrifying than the light that the middle-aged man had displayed before. "Who is it? He's been hiding here for so long without me noticing." The middle-aged cultivator's expression was extremely solemn, and his eyes were filled with indescribable shock. At the same time, the desire to retreat hidden in the depths of his eyes became unprecedentedly strong. One must know that he had always thought that he was the most powerful expert in the fourth level. However, not only did the rogue cultivator that he looked down on hide a secret that he could not pry into, but there was also such a powerful expert hidden in a place that he thought did not exist. How could he remain calm? Senior Sister May? At this moment, the expression of Luo Fan, who was sitting in his own world group, changed slightly, and revealed an indescribable curiosity in his eyes. The place that had changed was none other than the place where he had sealed Senior Sister May. Or rather, of the position of the place in the real world group. At this moment, Senior Sister May had used some unknown method to forcefully tear open the barrier between the planes. She was currently heading towards the real world at an incomparably fast speed. At the same time, she also activated the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, causing the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to surge towards her like never before. What's the point of this? Even if I break free from the seal, I'll just be captured and suppressed by the Tao Master's prison. Doubts flashed through his mind. At this moment, Senior Sister May's body, wrapped in the endless terrifying light, broke through the layers of seals on her, and appeared out of thin air in the middle of the endless creation power of the fourth level of the Tao Master's road. At the same time, the surging power of the Tao Master's prison had already rushed to her side and completely drowned her. At this moment, there was no despair on Senior Sister May's face. Instead, there was an indescribable heartache and pity. Then, a blood-red light began to expand from her body, and in the blink of an eye, it had enveloped her body. The blood-red light was extremely mysterious, and its presence was even stronger than Senior Sister May's. If the two were to be compared, the blood-red light was like the real body, while Senior Sister May's body was like a shadow. After the light appeared on the surface of her body, it began to distort and change, displaying all sorts of strange forms, as if it was a real living being. This kind of feeling was somewhat similar to that of the ball of light that the middle-aged cultivator had released earlier, which was like a living thing. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison had already forcefully poured into the blood-red light, completely enveloping it from the inside out. Then, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to surge, and the blood-red light gradually turned illusory. Not long after, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. Only Senior Sister May, who was no longer enveloped by the blood-red light, remained on the spot. The heartache on her face could not be concealed at all. There's actually such a substitution technique, as expected of a Tao Master's disciple. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Although he had never seen Senior Sister May use such a method on anyone else, he had never seen anyone else use it. But he could not be more clear about the result of this technique. After all, the power of the Tao Master's prison was obviously triggered by Senior Sister May. The purpose of their arrival was to capture Senior Sister May, who had used the power that the fourth level could not contain, into the Tao Master's prison to suppress and punish her. However, she did not expect the power of the Tao Sovereign's purgatory to completely ignore her. Instead, it captured the blood-red light that was being emitted from her body. Even if they had not seen this process before, they should know that it was a substitution technique that could deceive the Tao Master's prison. And judging from her heartache, this substitution technique clearly had a great limit. The price she had to pay to use it once was enough to make the Tao Master's prison, who had already ascended to a higher level, feel heartache. How dare you do such a thing? All of a sudden, Senior Sister May's expression changed drastically. Indescribable anger and panic appeared in her eyes, and even her voice became like a scream. At this moment, she no longer looked as charming as she did before. Right now, she looked like a village woman who was throwing a tantrum. At this moment, she had clearly seen the changes in the Tao Master's domain. She saw that the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain from the rogue cultivator's domain had been largely destroyed. After the scream, she did not care about what happened to Luo Fan, the other Tao Masters, or the middle-aged cultivator who clearly did not fit in with the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Instead, an extremely strange, obscure, and mysterious fluctuation began to radiate from her body. After the fluctuation left her body, it began to stir the void, stirring up the endless power of creation in the surroundings. It even seeped through the power of creation into the void behind the power of creation, and after some indescribable change and sublimation, it was about to advance to an even more subtle place. Oh no, she's summoning the Tao Master's domain from the fifth level. Stop her. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator roared in shock and anger. If it was just between him and Luo Fan, he was naturally Luo Fan's opponent and enemy. The two of them could not be said to be irreconcilable, but it was difficult for them to coexist peacefully. However, if there was a higher-level Tao Master's domain, then the situation would obviously be different. No matter which level he was a rogue cultivator, he was still a rogue cultivator. Perhaps to him, who had already transcended the fourth level, the Tao Master's domain was no longer in his eyes, so they could not be considered his enemies. However, he could no longer ignore the Tao Master's domain on the fifth level or even higher. One had to know that with the Tao Master's style, it was impossible for them to not offend the rogue cultivators on the fifth level and coexist peacefully. They would definitely oppress the rogue cultivators on the fifth level and above. Under such circumstances, to the middle-aged cultivator, the higher-level Tao Master's domain was obviously irreconcilable. Since the Tao Master's domain was like this to him, he was naturally not a welcome guest to the Tao Master's domain. Therefore, it could be imagined that when the higher-level Tao Master's domain descended and discovered his existence, they would definitely not be stingy in attacking him and conveniently erasing him. It was precisely because he understood this that the middle-aged cultivator did not care about the life and death battle between him and Luo Fan, and directly asked Luo Fan to stop Senior Sister May from the perspective of being on the same side. Luo Fan followed the good and flowed. At this moment, he only smiled, and a wave of power instantly swept across the endless power of creation and swept towards Senior Sister May. A barrier instantly sealed off Senior Martial Sister May. This barrier was not the one that sealed Senior Sister May, but the one that he had comprehended when he was fighting with the middle-aged cultivator. It was the barrier that separated the rogue cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Senior Sister May instinctively wanted to use the method she had used to break the seal to resist this barrier. When the boundless light collided with the barrier, it instantly produced an earth-shattering tremor. Boundless ripples, boundless heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time were born from the boundless power of creation around the point of impact, and then quickly disappeared without a trace. Then, they reappeared and disappeared again, forming a seemingly never-ending cycle. Following this chaos, the summoning fluctuation that Senior Sister May had previously released was naturally cut off. Senior Sister May's body suffered too great of an impact, and she could not help but spit out a large mouthful of blood. Her face turned pale, and it took her a long time to recover. "Wouldn't it be fine if you obediently let yourself be sealed? When it's about time, I'll let you out. What's the use of paying such a huge sacrifice to escape now?" Luo Fan sighed, and his figure condensed in front of Senior Sister May. Senior Sister May looked at him, and her expression changed slightly. When she was previously sealed, she did not feel the passage of time at all. As soon as she came out, she immediately saw that the barrier between the Tao Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain had been destroyed. She began to seek for other Tao Master's disciples who were at the same or higher level as her, and had no time to calculate how much time had passed. In this way, the Luo Fan in her mind was naturally not much different from the one who had sealed her. She didn't expect that from the beginning until now. Luo Fan's every move had given her a huge shock. Compared to the state where he could only use some tricks to win in front of her, the current him was simply not at the same level as before. Just his aura alone was far superior to before. "Do you know how big a mistake you have made?" Senior Sister May gathered her thoughts and said coldly. At this moment, her expression had already recovered. The sorry state that had appeared on her body earlier had already been swept away. Clearly, she had calmed down once again. "Did I make a mistake? It is true for you, but for the Rogue Cultivators, I am afraid that I have created great merit." Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Merit? From what I can see, he doesn't seem like he's acknowledging your merit." Senior Sister May said indifferently. At this time, Luo Fan felt a familiar power shrouding his body. This was the power that had caused his doppelganger to collapse, and he had to rely on the support of his main body in order to barely recover. It was also the power that was released by the middle-aged cultivator, which was like a living thing. "It changes really fast." Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. Bang! With a soft sound, his body was instantly destroyed, and everything was completely wiped out. It was as if he had never existed in the fourth level. Moreover, with his disappearance, the huge vortex of creation power seemed to tremble slightly, as if it was about to collapse. However, it only seemed like it. Although it trembled a few times, it still quickly stabilized. Then, a figure that seemed to have existed since the beginning of time appeared not far away from the middle-aged cultivator, quietly looking at the middle-aged cultivator. Naturally, it was Luo Fan, who had been resurrected through the connection between the other levels and the real world. "I thought we could cooperate a little." Luo Fan sighed, and a look of pity appeared on his face. Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator had a look of disbelief on his face, and he exclaimed, "How is this possible? I've clearly erased everything about you. How can you still be alive?" At this time, Senior Sister May sneered and said, "If it wasn't because he had such a method, why do you think I would need to summon other powerhouses?" Her words were filled with strong unwillingness and bewilderment. Chapter 2241. At this moment, Luo Fan obviously had no intention of waiting for the other party to react. Since the other party had launched a sneak attack on him just now, he was naturally prepared to suffer a backlash. At this moment, he did not hesitate to summon the barrier between the levels. In an instant, the middle-aged cultivator was directly wrapped in the barrier, and with a pull, the middle-aged cultivator was pulled into the barrier between the reality level and the conceptual level. Following this change, in the eyes of Senior Sister May, the middle-aged cultivator had already fallen into the previous state of being sealed by Luo Fan, and directly disappeared from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. "What method did you use?" Even after seeing him again, Senior Sister May was still shocked by the means he had used, and an extremely grave expression appeared on her face. The reason why she was able to escape just now was because she had sacrificed the only magic treasure she had obtained in the 5th level. Although she had already escaped, she still had no idea what kind of method Luo Fan had used. If she were to encounter such a seal again, she still had no idea how to escape. In other words, if Luo Fan used the same means to seal her now, she actually had no confidence that she would be able to escape. In fact, it was precisely because of this that she immediately activated the summoning as soon as she escaped, and summoned the high-level disciples of the Tao Master to deal with Luo Fan. Otherwise, after suffering such a big loss, why would she not want to deal with Luo Fan herself? Why would she so easily decide to hand over the task of dealing with Luo Fan to someone else? It seems that you have no other means. Luo Fan looked at Senior Sister May and said thoughtfully. Hearing this, Senior Sister May's expression suddenly changed. This was the truth, but the meaning behind it was completely different when it was said directly by the other party. Immediately, she said, "Do you want to try? Do you really think that a small rogue cultivator like you can really suppress the disciples of the Tao Master in terms of means?" Luo Fan just smiled and raised his hand to point at the huge whirlpool in the distance. He did not speak, but his meaning could not be clearer. After all, the vortex could be said to be the root cause of the collapse of the barrier between the territory of the rogue cultivators and the territory of the Tao Master. It was also the place where the wills of the Tao Masters were sucked into the group of worlds. No matter which one it was Luo Fan's victory over the Tao Master's disciples. In other words, the existence of this vortex was the most direct refutation of Senior May's words. But Luo Fan didn't even need to say anything to refute. Senior Sister May was quick-witted and naturally understood his meaning in an instant. Her expression suddenly stiffened. At this time, she secretly scolded the disciples of the Tao Masters of the 4th level for being so disappointing. They were all caught in one fell swoop in such a short time. It's just a little advantage, and you're already so arrogant? You just haven't pushed them to their limits yet. If you push them to their limits, each of them will be able to burst out with explosive power that is not inferior to mine. If you don't believe me, you can try. Senior Sister May said lightly. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "You're making me a little afraid." As he spoke, he raised his hand and was about to grab the whirlpool. At this moment, Senior Sister May's expression suddenly changed. She did not expect Luo Fan to be so violent. What she said before was naturally not a lie. If the disciples of the Tao Masters really went all out, they would indeed be able to burst out with explosive power that was far beyond their original limits and display power that was far beyond their own ability. However, what she did not say was that in order to burst out such power that was beyond their limits, the price that the disciples of the Tao Masters had to pay must be unimaginably huge. Perhaps, with a single sacrifice, these disciples of the Tao Masters would return to a state of having nothing overnight, and they would become inferior to ordinary rogue cultivators. Given this person's methods, even if he paid such a price and burst out an attack that was beyond his limits, he did not seem to have absolute confidence that he could win or even escape. In this way, this kind of price would only make the rogue cultivator in front of him exclaim in surprise for a moment. There was no meaning to it at all. If this really happened, when the disciples of the Tao Masters found out that it was because of what she said that the rogue cultivator forced them to pay the price and burst out an attack that was beyond their limits, they would most likely tear her to shreds. Don't worry, there is no irreconcilable hatred between me and the disciples of the Tao Masters. At this moment, Luo Fan's words instantly pulled Senior Sister May out of the abyss of helplessness. Hearing this, Senior Sister May was stunned and said, "What do you mean? Do you still think that there is a possibility of us reconciling after what you've done?" As she spoke, she could not help but sneer disdainfully. As a disciple of the Tao Master, she was born to be high and mighty. She was born to be above all rogue cultivators. All rogue cultivators were born to be exploited by her, and should be a level lower than others in front of her. Any actions that were detrimental to the disciples of the Tao Masters were naturally abhorrent to her, and could not be forgiven. Under such circumstances, everything that Luo Fan did might seem to him to be for the sake of his own cultivation. He was merely making use of the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, to Senior Sister May, it was an unforgivable provocation. If it was not for the fact that she could not think of a way to break through the seal that Luo Fan had placed on her, she would have long summoned the strongest disciple of the Tao Masters that she could contact to get rid of him. Why would she have the time to talk nonsense with him? Even at this moment, she seemed to be communicating with Luo Fan, but in fact, she was constantly analyzing the seal in the surroundings, trying to think of a way to break through it. When Luo Fan heard this, he smiled and said, "Reconciling? I don't think I need to reconcile with you." His words caused Senior Sister May's expression to change again. What kind of arrogance was this? Although the disciples of the Tao Masters are the direct disciples of the Tao Masters, cultivation is a personal matter. If you want to become a Tao Master, you really have to rely on yourself. No matter what your identity is, you are no different from us rogue cultivators in terms of the ultimate goal of becoming a Tao Master. What right do you have to stand above the rogue cultivators? What right do you have to make everyone be wary of you? What right do you have to make everyone be afraid of you? There is no difference whether our relationship is reconciled or strained or even irreconcilable, Luo Fan said. His words made Senior Sister May's eyes burn with intense flames of anger. How arrogant! You won't be able to stand on the path of a Tao Master just because of this. Senior Sister May's voice sounded like a wild beast's roar. His voice was mixed with boundless shock, boundless anger, and even a deeply hidden sense of panic. At this moment, Senior Sister May was no longer as charming as before. All that was left was anger and even madness. For her, Luo Fan's various thoughts had already shaken the high and mighty foundation of the Tao Master. If all rogue cultivators thought like this, the Tao Master's disciples would never have a day of peace. They might even be knocked off their pedestals, and from then on, they would be stuck in the mud with the rogue cultivators. This was not something that a Tao Master's disciple like Senior Sister May could accept. In her opinion, what Luo Fan had displayed was even more unforgivable than what he had done to break the barrier between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. Compared to the rogue cultivator on the third floor, who had also mixed the rogue cultivator's domain with the Tao Master's domain and expelled or killed the Tao Master's domain, it was even more unforgivable. This might seem incredible, but the logic behind it couldn't be any simpler. For the Tao Master's disciples, if they could split the path of becoming a Tao Master once, they could naturally split it countless times. Now that the third and fourth floors had been mixed together, there was no longer any difference between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. It seemed that the real fairness had been achieved. However, in the eyes of the Tao Master's high-level disciples, this was only temporary. It was only because the real experts did not care about this change that this state could appear and be maintained. If the matter really got out of hand and the real experts paid attention to it, then it would only be a matter of a thought for the various floors to be divided again. Even if it really attracted the attention of the higher-ups, this division might be even more absolute and irresistible than before. In this way, although they would be unhappy with the changes in the lower levels, they would be angry and would want to tear the rogue cultivator into pieces. In fact, they would not take them seriously. At most, they would think that the rogue cultivator was just an ant who could jump around. However, compared to this, Luo Fan had directly erased the status of the Tao Master's disciples, thought that there was no difference between the Tao Master's disciples and rogue cultivators, and thought that the Tao Master's disciples had no better chance of becoming a Tao Master than the rogue cultivators. For the Tao Master's disciples, this was an absolutely unforgivable provocation. If such thoughts and views were really accepted by all rogue cultivators, then the status of the Tao Master's disciples would no longer be as stable as it was now. Then the other rogue cultivators who were encouraged by such views and ideas would probably have a shocking impact on the rule of the Tao Master's disciples. In the end, the losses they would suffer would be countless times greater than the loss of the Tao Master's path. After all, in addition to the Tao Master's disciples, there were also many rogue cultivators at the higher levels. Thinking of countless rogue cultivators pouncing on her, shouting for equality and freedom, the killing intent in Senior Sister May's heart grew stronger. I must not let this person ascend to a higher level. At this moment, such a decision emerged from the bottom of her heart. Even the idea of self-sacrifice emerged from the bottom of her heart. Although Luo Fan did not know the specific way in which Senior Sister May changed her mind, he clearly knew that after he finished speaking, the woman's momentum suddenly changed. Originally, it seemed that she just wanted to escape, but now it had become an indescribable killing intent. A killing intent that could not wait to perish together with him. Such a spirit of sacrifice, it's like that of a martyr who has sacrificed everything to protect his ideals. Looking at this woman, Luo Fan could not help but have such a thought, and his eyes could not help but show a sense of inquiry. At this moment, a faint light began to emerge from Senior Sister May's body. This light quickly attacked the barrier created by Luo Fan, which was formed by the mysteries of the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's path. Compared to the power of the simple world group, this barrier was thousands of times stronger. However, compared to the mysteries of the 5th level, it was obviously not strong enough. At this moment, under the impact of the light that seemed to be alive, the barrier began to shake and cracks constantly appeared on the barrier. Even though the barrier's power was quickly mending, its sound and movement did not disappear because of this mending. Instead, it was constantly emitting countless strange sounds. This sound stirred up the surrounding power of creation, causing the power of creation to give birth to countless strange worlds, and space-time. It looked like an incomparably strange, sound-wave world that was constantly being born and destroyed. At the same time, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to appear faintly in the surroundings. The power of the Tao Master's prison was obviously superior to the Tao Master's path. Even if there was endless creation energy in the surroundings, even if the creation energy could pull out a world, and a space-time from the river of time, it was still powerless in the face of the power of the Tao Master's purgatory. He couldn't even touch them. The two overlapped and did not even affect or interact with each other. It was as if they were on 2 different levels, 2 different dimensions. When it first appeared, the power of the Tao Master's purgatory was like a headless fly, scurrying around like a headless fly. It seemed to know that the cause of its appearance existed in this area, but it was unable to determine where it was or what it was. As time passed, as the light released from Senior Sister May's body became more and more intense and dazzling, the area that the power of the Tao Master's prison locked on seemed to become smaller and smaller. The feeling that seemed illusory and real naturally gradually changed towards reality. Chapter 2242. After witnessing the middle-aged loose cultivator display the light that was condensed into a living being, as well as the light that Senior Sister May displayed a few times, which was incomplete, but already had the characteristics of a living being, Luo Fan finally comprehended a trace of the essence of this light. Living things were something that ordinary living things were born with. It was naturally an incredible miracle to be able to condense them with one's own strength and will. However, for cultivators, as long as they reached the Khanate Grand Luo, splitting the heavens and earth was a piece of cake. Creating living things depended on one's own will. Under such circumstances, what was the big deal about using one's own will and strength to create living things? Khanate Grand Luo cultivators were merely ants to any cultivator who could step onto the Tao Master path, let alone Senior Sister May, who was a powerful existence who had already stepped onto the 5th level of the Tao Master path. for existences at their level, they could even casually create worlds formed by billions of heavens and earth. How could they take the will of a living thing seriously? However, it was clear that regardless of whether it was the cultivator from before or Senior May, both of them attached unimaginable importance to the light that was like a living thing. In fact, the power of the lifelike light had already surpassed the imagination of all living things. It was far above the world group. This kind of contradiction had already made Luo Fan somewhat puzzled and moved from the beginning. However, because he did not know anything about the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, he did not force himself to dig out its secrets or replicate the method. Since he did not know the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, he did not force himself to dig out its secrets or replicate the method. However, after seeing the incomplete display of the lifelike light displayed by Senior Sister May, coupled with the power of the lifelike light displayed by the middle-aged cultivator, he finally grasped a key point and found a trace of the essence of the light. The light itself naturally contained a supreme power that surpassed the power of the world group. There was no doubt about this. However, the will that was derived from the light that controlled this power was not the will of an ordinary living thing. It was a higher-level will that far surpassed the level of living things. It was the will of the world. This kind of will existed in every world and every world. However, the will of this kind of existence varied depending on the world. Moreover, even if it was created, it was impossible to control or understand this kind of will. From the beginning of their existence, they completely followed the needs of their own world or the world. They controlled the world, operated the world, and operated the world. This kind of will was obviously an existence that did not have much meaning to the creator of the world. This was Luo Fan's understanding of the will of the world. It was precisely because of this understanding that he had never thought of controlling the world will, even if there were countless world wills that had been born under his hands. He had never thought of controlling the world will. He did not want to use the world will as his own power to fight his enemies. However, at this moment, Senior Sister May had appeared in front of him, as well as the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the fifth level, who had been completely sealed by him. It was clear that Pina had done something that he had not been able to do before. She had taken control of the will of the world. In other words, they had taken the initiative to condense a will of the world that was completely under their control. Looking at their control over the light and the supreme might that was emitted from the light, it was obvious that their control over the will of the world had already reached the acme of perfection. There was not the slightest bit of reluctance, nor was there the slightest bit of indirection. It was as though these wills were an extension of their will. After understanding the nature of the light, Luo Fan felt that the light was completely different when he looked at it again. Previously, he could only see that it was a ball of light. At most, it was like a living thing. But now, when he looked at it again, he found that the light contained endless rules and principles, endless time and space, endless matter and energy, and endless wonderful power that could not be described with words or even measured. All of this was completely under the command of the will of the world. All the conflicts and contradictions existing in it were swept away by the will at the level of the will of the world, and they were completely integrated into a complete, unified whole. In the end, everything was sublimated and released a terrifying power that was far beyond the mysteries contained in the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's Road. It's indeed worthy of the mysteries contained in the 5th level. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim. At this moment, the barrier that he had built, which was formed by the combination of the mysteries contained in the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's Road, was completely torn apart by the light that was like a living thing. The incomparably strong light instantly tore apart the cover of the power of creation and spread in all directions, leaving deep marks in the power of creation that could not be healed for a long time. At this moment, The power of the Tao Master's prison in the surroundings seemed to have suddenly found a target and began to quickly gather towards the light. It wrapped the light in it and continuously sent it into the Tao Master's prison. However, they could only be used on the balls of light that seemed to be alive. Senior Sister May, who was the main body that released the light, did not do anything at all. It was as if these rays of light were the true main body, and Senior May was merely an extension of these rays of light. She can actually use such a method to deal with the power of the Tao Master's prison. She is indeed worthy of being a disciple of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed again, his eyes full of admiration. He did not know how many times he had felt this way ever since he met Senior Sister May. However, every time she used her power, he still felt that his horizons were widened and he could not help but sigh with the same emotion. Compared to Luo Fan's admiration, Senior Sister May was obviously not so relaxed at this moment. At this moment, as the light that was like a living thing was being sent into the Tao Master's prison, she looked more and more exhausted. Her body trembled continuously during this process. It felt as if a knife was constantly cutting her flesh. As for her aura, it became weaker and weaker with this change. The power in her body surged endlessly, and an indescribable pain appeared on her face. Her eyes flickered with indescribable madness and determination. After the admiration, Luo Fan sighed and said, "Is it really worth it to use such a method? I don't know how you did it, but what you're doing now is equivalent to sending your doppelganger into the Tao Master's prison to take your place. You've already divided millions of light balls, which is equivalent to creating millions of doppelgangers to take your place. This is millions of times more painful than directly entering with your real body. Do you really think it's worth it to pay such a price?" Hearing his words, Senior Sister May's expression did not change at all. With a loud roar, her body was enveloped by the endless light and the power of the Tao Master's prison as she charged towards him. With this charge, the surrounding creation power seemed to be swept up by her and began to charge towards Luo Fan along with her charge. The power of creation was clearly an incomparably mysterious power. It even contained some characteristics of the state of chaos. The changes that could be produced by such power were naturally endless. At this moment, under the influence of the light that was like a living thing, they began to transform into the light at an unimaginable speed. In other words, they were transformed into the endless laws, time, space, matter, energy, and mysterious power that made up the light. As Senior Sister May approached Luo Fan, the light on her body became stronger and more terrifying. Even if the power of the Tao Master's purgatory was constantly removing the light, it could not change the trend of the change. Puff with a soft sound, the light had already completely submerged Luo Fan's body. Endless terrifying power rushed towards him, and the power of the world group, the barrier that he had comprehended from the Tao Master's domain and the rogue cultivator's domain, and even the power of the concept divine ability that he had hidden at the bottom of the world of laws, were instantly dispersed by the light. Throughout the entire process, there was not even the slightest impact or turbulence. It was as if all the impact and turbulence had been annihilated by the light and could no longer appear. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan did not allow his body to be annihilated and then resurrect with the help of the connection between the other planes and reality. After all, this kind of thing required a bit of time. Obviously, he could not afford to waste this little bit of time when he needed to restrict Senior Sister May's contact with the higher levels. Therefore, at this moment, with just a slight movement of his mind, a barrier appeared around his body, blocking the overwhelming light that was rushing towards him like a living thing. Although the nature of the light was extremely high and contained the mysteries of the will of heaven and earth, as well as endless rules of law and time and space, ultimately, it had not reached the realm of surpassing reality. In the end, the barrier between the levels that Luo Fan had summoned was still so powerless. In front of the barrier, all the light was like a wave hitting a dam. It could only set off huge waves, but could not shake the barrier at all. At this moment, Senior Sister May did not pay attention to Luo Fan at all. At this moment, she was trying hard to send her own will through the fluctuations to the higher levels. She was trying her best to penetrate the barrier between the levels of the Tao Master's Road and enter the 5th or even the 6th level. Unfortunately, she had obviously misjudged Luo Fan's response this time. In the previous attack, in order to better understand her means, Luo Fan had used his own body to receive her attack. Therefore, after her attack, there would usually be a process of his body disappearing. During this process, everything related to him would become weak. Even the world group would show signs of collapse and destruction for a while. If Luo Fan had responded to Senior Sister May's attack according to the previous response, then at this time, there would be a flaw in the interception of Senior Sister May's connection. And this flaw would be enough for her to transmit her will to the higher levels and attract the disciples of the higher levels of the Tao Master. However, obviously, at this time, Luo Fan did not choose to do so. At this time, he was perfectly protected by the barrier between the levels. Even his body did not suffer much impact. How could there be a flaw because of the death of his body in the reality? Without this flaw, how could Senior Sister May's plan succeed? At that moment, the fluctuations that contained her will directly collided with the barrier between the layers. Just like the light that she emitted, which seemed to be a living thing, collided with the barrier around Luo Fan's body. It didn't cause any ripples at all, and it completely collapsed. Sensing this change, Senior Sister May's pupils shrank and a look of despair appeared in her eyes. This despair was not because she was going to be imprisoned in the Tao Master's prison. Instead, it was because she no longer had any chance to cut off the malignant tumor that was Luo Fan. "It's a pity that my decision is a little late," she murmured in despair. At this time, the power of the Tao Master's prison had completely penetrated all the obstruction of the light around her body. It directly wrapped around her body and pulled her, making her more and more illusory and blurry. Not long after, only a faintly discernible shadow of her was left, as if she could disappear at any time. This was obviously the scene of her being pulled towards the Tao Master's prison by the power of the Tao Master's prison. "It's not that your decision is too late." Luo Fan looked at this scene and murmured. Perhaps, in Senior Sister May's opinion, if she had made the previous decision when Luo Fan was still understanding her methods and seized the opportunity to summon a high-level expert, Luo Fan would have been erased by a Tao Master of a higher level by now. However, only he knew that if Senior Sister May had really done this, he would have already used the mysteries of the various levels to get rid of her. After all, although Senior Sister May's strength surpassed that of Luo Fan, who had just stepped into the 4th level not long ago, in the real world. However, that was only in the real world. In other levels, such as the conceptual level or the karma level, Senior Sister May was not much better than a dead object. If Luo Fan really wanted to, he could easily crush her corresponding existence through those levels. At that time, the Senior Sister May in the real world would naturally die soon and her soul would dissipate. Chapter 2243. At this moment, a strange change suddenly shrouded the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path. All the time attribute was completely frozen at this moment. Whether it was the time attribute contained in the power of creation, the time attribute of the Tao Master's prison, or even Luo Fan's own time attribute, all of them had completely frozen. "What's this?" At this moment, Luo Fan, who was aware of this change through his own concept of existence, suddenly felt a jolt in his heart. At this time, his concept of existence probed the reality level with the help of the connection between the levels. In an instant, he found that the entire reality level had completely frozen. It was as if time had suddenly stopped, and everything that should have changed under the flow of time had completely stopped at that moment. Senior Sister May, who had been forcibly pulled into the Tao Master's prison by the power of the Tao Master's prison, was frozen there in a state where she was about to completely disappear. Even the power of the Tao Master's prison seemed to have suddenly turned into a substance and mixed with the endless power of creation. Luo Fan's body in the reality level did not feel anything at all, and maintained an inexplicable expression. Sensing slightly with his concept of existence, he knew that his self in the reality level was now completely without any thoughts. All of his thoughts, and even all of his thoughts, were maintained at the moment when time stopped. At this moment, a faintly discernible figure gradually emerged from the stagnation. This figure looked like a middle-aged man with a sallow complexion. He was dressed in a gray robe and his eyes were cloudy. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man who would appear at any time on the streets of a small secular city. However, at this time, Luo Fan did not dare to regard him as an ordinary person at all. An ordinary person could never appear on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, it was even more impossible for him to move freely when the time attribute of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had completely stopped. Just from the way he appeared, it was enough to see that the strength and realm of this middle-aged man with a sallow complexion had at least surpassed Luo Fan's. Who would have thought that in just a few trillion years, the fourth level would have fallen to such a state? The middle-aged man sighed. As he spoke, he casually pointed with his hand, and senior sister May, who had almost completely disappeared, began to solidify again. Not long after, she had completely returned to her original appearance. However, even so, senior sister May still didn't feel or move at this moment. She was still in a state where time was completely frozen. She was no different from Luo Fan. They were no different from the countless living beings in the world clusters. The waxen middle-aged man looked at her with a frown. With a wave of his hand, the power of the endless Tao Master's prison in the surroundings completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Seeing this, Luo Fan was extremely shocked. One should know that this was the power of the Tao Master's purgatory. It was a kind of power that targeted almost all cultivators and all existences on the road to becoming a Tao Master. This kind of power was almost unique to all cultivators. Any cultivator in front of it should be unable to resist it. How could it be easily brushed away by the waxen middle-aged man, as if he was manipulating plasticine? What is this person's realm? At this moment, such a doubt appeared in his mind. With a slight thought, his corresponding existences on each level began to look around for the waxen middle-aged man's corresponding existences on each level in reality. Although his ability to control his corresponding existences on each level was not as good as his ability to control his own body in reality. However, it had reached a level that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. To him, searching for the existence of a certain object on various levels was almost as easy as searching for an object on the table in front of him. Very quickly, he had already locked his perception onto the strange existences that existed on various levels. It's actually this way of existence. Looking at the strange existences, Luo Fan was inexplicably shocked. Although the waxen middle-aged man couldn't do what Luo Fan did and perfectly control his existence in the other layers, he had used another method to protect his existence in the other layers. For example, on the conceptual level, the waxen middle-aged man's corresponding existences did exist. However, at this moment, the concept of existence that he corresponded to was restrained to the extreme. It looked incomparably small, and it even gave off a faintly discernible feeling. When one slightly manipulated other existences to come into contact with him, one would find that almost all contact with the waxen middle-aged man's existence was difficult. Only a very small number of existences that contained his strong will could really touch the waxen middle-aged man's existence. This was not only on the conceptual level, but also on the corresponding existences on other levels. Almost on every level, the waxen middle-aged man's existence was extremely difficult to touch and restrained to an extremely small state. If it weren't for Luo Fan's will being strong enough, and his ability to control the existences corresponding to each level was beyond imagination. Perhaps even he wouldn't be able to touch the various existences corresponding to each level, At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man seemed to have sensed something. His expression shook, and he suddenly looked at Luo Fan, who had been frozen in time in the real world. The turbidity in his eyes instantly disappeared and turned into an unimaginable profundity that seemed to contain endless mysteries of the world. Everything that was illuminated by his eyes seemed to be exposed to him in an instant. After a long time, he could not see anything, and his brows furrowed even deeper. Could it be an illusion? He muttered. As he muttered, he retracted his gaze. Just at the moment when Luo Fan thought that he was not going to take any action, the waxen middle-aged man suddenly raised his hand and slapped toward Luo Fan. This slap was extremely hasty and carried infinite power. It felt as if all the power, all the changes, and all the power in the fourth level of the Tao Master's Road were instantly condensed in his palm, and he sent it straight toward Luo Fan at this moment. In this state of stagnation of time, the only one who could move was him. In other words, the only one who had the time attribute and could still describe it as experiencing time was him. Under such circumstances, his slap naturally came to Luo Fan at a speed that surpassed everything. Only to hear, in an instant, an earth-shattering shock began to spread from where Luo Fan was standing in all directions. Even the surrounding time attribute, which had been completely frozen by some incomparably powerful power, began to flow again. Earth-shattering movements continued to emerge, and the endless creation power in the surroundings was pushing, leaving an increasingly large vacuum around Luo Fan's body. In other words, around the area where Luo Fan originally existed, because, at this moment, under the violent explosion of power, Luo Fan's body in the real world had completely collapsed, and not even a single fragment remained. Everything had been completely devoured by the creation power. It's not him. Seeing this scene, the waxen middle-aged man said doubtfully. Obviously, he was not sure that the wrong morality he sensed was from Luo Fan. However, just because of this suspicion, he had already brazenly attacked and directly erased Luo Fan to prove his speculation. Seeing that Luo Fan had turned into ashes, the waxen middle-aged man shook his head and put it down. Then, with a wave of his hand, the time attribute on Senior Sister May's body, which was frozen not far from him, began to break free from its shackles and move again. As the time attribute regained its agility, the frozen and lifeless feeling on Senior Sister May's body naturally disappeared without a trace. What replaced it was a kind of agility that was far more powerful than before. I also checked a little more. Looking at Senior Sister May, who had become more agile, but had not fully recovered, the waxen middle-aged man muttered. Then, with a wave of his hand, balls of light that seemed to be alive appeared out of thin air and began to gather towards Senior Sister May. In the blink of an eye, they merged with Senior Sister May and disappeared. As more and more light merged with her, the agility on Senior Sister May's body became stronger and stronger. Finally, at a certain moment, when the last ball of light merged with her body, Senior Sister May's eyes moved slightly, and her originally lifeless eyes began to regain their agility. The waxen middle-aged man's appearance was imprinted into her eyes. The moment she saw the waxen middle-aged man, an indescribable look of joy appeared on Senior Sister May's face. She bowed and said, "Thank you, Senior Brother, for saving my life. No need to be so polite. Fortunately, I'm on the 5th floor, or else no one would have been able to understand the distress signal you sent out. What exactly happened this time? How did you end up like this?" The waxen middle-aged man helped Senior Sister May up as he spoke. Hearing this, Senior Sister May's face became slightly red. She said, "It's a long story. I hope Senior Brother can deal with the culprit first. If he stays for even a moment longer, there will be more variables." "Culprit? Are you talking about the wandering cultivator who was here just now?" the waxen middle-aged man asked. At this moment, Senior Sister May began to pay attention to her surroundings. When she saw the completely frozen state around her, a strong sense of admiration flashed through her eyes. She then looked at where Luo Fan was and found that there was nothing there. There was no longer any trace of Luo Fan. Only then did she let out a sigh of relief. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly thought of something and quickly asked, "Senior brother, did you encounter any resistance when you dealt with him just now?" "Resistance?" The waxen middle-aged man revealed a look of disdain. "You overestimate him. Although this person has some methods, he is only a wandering cultivator. How could he have the power to resist me? Not good. I hope Senior Brother can use your own detection methods to carefully investigate again. Although this person is not strong, his methods are really strange. Not only does he have a powerful defensive method, he also has some unknown method of resurrection. No matter how thoroughly he is destroyed, he can recover in an instant. Since he was killed without even struggling, there must be a trap," Senior Sister May said anxiously. From the moment she first met Luo Fan, the deepest impression that Luo Fan had left on her was his repeated deaths and rebirths. This kind of resurrection surpassed any resurrection from death that she had seen before. It also surpassed all resurrections from death that she had imagined. It felt as if he completely rejected the concept of death. No matter what method he used, no matter how thoroughly he destroyed it, it was just a change in his state. As long as he wanted to, he could reverse it at any time and get rid of the state of death once again. Because of this, although she did not see how the waxen middle-aged man dealt with Luo Fan, she instinctively felt that this person, who had not seen Luo Fan's resurrection from death, would not be able to kill him. Hearing Senior Sister May's words, the waxen middle-aged man frowned. "There is already a shadow in your heart. If you don't get rid of this shadow, I'm afraid that it will be detrimental to your future growth. You will need to work on this in your future cultivation." These words clearly showed that he did not feel that Senior Sister May's worries were meaningless. He was extremely certain that he had already dealt with Luo Fan. Hearing this, Senior Sister May became even more anxious. Every time she dealt with Luo Fan, she felt as certain as this waxen middle-aged man. The waxen middle-aged man's confident state made her unconsciously remember the feeling she had after she dealt with Luo Fan. The feeling that Luo Fan had not died and was still using some method to resurrect became even stronger. "Don't be conflicted. The method I used is not something you can understand right now. The most important thing for you right now is to get rid of the shadow in your heart. Otherwise, I'm afraid that you will never be able to understand the method I used." The waxen middle-aged man saw that Senior Sister May was still unrelenting and sighed in disappointment. Hearing this, Senior Sister May was stunned. For a moment, she did not know what to say to make the waxen middle-aged man listen to her. Chapter 2244. The waxen middle-aged man looked at Senior Sister May with pity in his eyes. The existence of psychological trauma had different effects on different existences. The more powerful a being was, the more troublesome it would be to have a psychological trauma. For example, if an ordinary person had a psychological trauma, all they needed to do was find a psychiatrist and it might be resolved. Moreover, if the trauma wasn't too great, they might be able to think it through after some stimulation, and they might not even need to find a psychiatrist to resolve it. However, if it wasn't an ordinary person who had a psychological trauma, but a cultivator with cultivation, the situation would be different. Even if it was a cultivator who had yet to become an immortal, having a psychological trauma might lead to chi deviation. It would cause many years of cultivation to be destroyed, and it might even have a huge impact on others. As for cultivators who had become immortals, the impact would be much stronger than those who had yet to become immortals. If the trauma was too great, it might even turn into a demon, obtaining a form that was somewhere between tangible and intangible. It would break away from the cultivator and wreak havoc in the world. On the other hand, if a connate grand heavenly realm cultivator were to develop a shadow in their heart, the shadow might transform into a space that was in between reality and illusion at some point in time. The influence of this was countless times greater than the shadow transforming into a demon. Further up, there were demi-saints, false saints, despairing emperors, tribulation cultivators, and so on. The more powerful a being was, the more terrifying the psychological trauma would be. For a tribulation cultivator who had reached Senior Sister May's level, if the psychological trauma lingered, it was almost certain that a psychological trauma would be born. And the first target of such a psychological trauma would not be anyone else, but Senior Sister May herself. In other words, if Senior Sister May Jujio could see through this psychological shadow, who knew when she would be pulled into that psychological shadow world while she was cultivating? She would turn into all kinds of strange existences and suffer endless torment. It went without saying that this would have a huge impact on her cultivation. It was precisely because of this that the waxen middle-aged man felt so regretful. After all, he had always felt that Senior Sister May's comprehension ability was enough for her to reach his level faster than him. Now that there was this hidden danger, it had almost completely cut off all possibilities for her to reach this level. How could he not feel that it was a pity? You must pay attention to this shadow. Don't wait until it's too big in the future to deal with it. If you do that, it'll be too late. After a long time, the waxen middle-aged man advised. Senior Sister May opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she was unable to say anything. Her expression was filled with helplessness. Forget it, you can say whatever you want. In any case, you will know who is right in a while. After a long while, she sighed and gave up on explaining. As for why she was so sure that the waxen middle-aged man would know that she was right, the reason was very simple. She believed that with Luo Fan's style of doing things, it was absolutely impossible for him to allow this expert who had killed him once to leave the fourth level so easily, whether it was to investigate the means of this expert or to take revenge for the danger of being killed once. He would definitely not do nothing. Her words made the waxen middle-aged man even more certain that her psychological shadow was quite stubborn. Immediately, the pity in his eyes became even more intense. Let's go. Although the Tao Master's prison has been blocked by me, it can't last long. We should leave this level as soon as possible. The waxen middle-aged man said after feeling that it was a pity. Senior Sister May naturally nodded indifferently. Whether she agreed or not, the result would be the same. Luo Fan would definitely make his move, and it would be impossible for them to leave so easily. If she didn't agree, she would need to explain why she didn't agree and what her plans were. In contrast, agreeing would not affect the result of the matter, but it would save him a lot of trouble. So, why not? The waxen middle-aged man raised his hand and grabbed towards Senior Sister May. In an instant, an indescribable wave enveloped her, causing her to seem to be gradually separated from the fourth level. It was as if she had become an independent and complete individual. I thought you would repair the barrier first. It seems like you are still unable to do that with your strength. At this moment, a voice was transmitted into the ears of the waxen middle-aged man and Senior Sister May. Hearing this, the two of them had completely different expressions on their faces. The waxen middle-aged man's face suddenly became extremely ugly, as if something unbelievable had happened in front of him. Senior Sister May was nervous and happy at the same time. It was as if the thing that she had been anticipating and guarding against had finally happened. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure slowly appeared in front of the two of them. An indescribable wave instantly swept over them, instantly breaking the wave that connected the two of them. The waxen middle-aged man and Senior Sister May no longer had any connection, and the two of them became independent once again. How can you still have time? The waxen middle-aged man asked solemnly. Although he was extremely surprised at how Luo Fan had been resurrected, He was even more surprised that Luo Fan could still move at this time. After all, he had completely frozen all the time attribute in the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. The effect of this stagnation was so strong that even the power of the Tao Master's prison could not escape. He could only obediently release Senior Sister Mei from the state where she had almost been thrown into the Tao Master's prison. Even an existence at the same level as him would not be able to easily escape from such a powerful stagnation method if they were unprepared. Under such circumstances, how could the existence in front of him, who was clearly several levels lower than him, completely ignore his stagnation method? Is it strange for an existence at my level to create my own time? Luo Fan shrugged and said indifferently. At this moment, his time attribute was completely isolated from the outside world. In other words, he had once again cut off the connection between his space-time dimension and the space-time dimension of the outside world, so that his own space-time dimension would no longer be affected by any force or power from the outside world. Only in this way could he still move freely when the time attribute of the outside world was completely frozen, as if he was not affected at all. It's not strange to create my own time. However, even if it's my own time, it should be under my control. The waxen middle-aged man said coldly. At this time, he understood that he had misunderstood Senior Sister Mei. Perhaps Senior Sister Mei did not have any psychological trauma, and everything was just his own wild speculation. This person is extremely strange. It seems that he can comprehend a method after seeing it once. At first, his method was extremely crude, and he was not even a match for me. But now, after I attacked him several times, he almost left me at my wit's end. Senior Sister Mei said solemnly. Hearing this, the waxen middle-aged man frowned and said, "That should be because his level is about the same as yours, and he actually has the power that you have. The reason why he was crude at the beginning was because he did not have enough experience and could not unleash all his power. After seeing your method, he realized that his power could be used like that, so he was able to comprehend it so quickly." What he meant was that he did not think that his method could be comprehended by Luo Fan. At this time, Luo Fan looked at the waxen middle-aged man in front of him with a calm expression. Thoughts flashed in his mind, and countless ideas flashed in his mind. This waxen middle-aged man was many times stronger than Senior Sister Mei. Moreover, there was a mystery hidden in him that Senior Sister Mei did not have. It was a profound mystery of a higher level, more powerful, and more wondrous uses. Hearing what the waxen middle-aged man said, Senior Sister Mei nodded, and a look of understanding appeared in her eyes. Obviously, she believed in the waxen middle-aged man's judgment. In fact, within the scope of her understanding, it seemed that only the waxen middle-aged man's judgment could explain Luo Fan's strange improvement speed. That's great. This person's thinking is extremely dangerous. If we don't get rid of him, I'm afraid that he will leave a huge hidden danger for our position in the Tao Masters sect in the future. I hope that Senior Brother can completely get rid of him. Hearing what Senior Sister Mei said, the waxen middle-aged man frowned. Originally, he did not have any intention to get rid of Luo Fan. After all, he thought that Luo Fan was just an ant to him. If he helped Senior Sister Mei, he would already be suspected of bullying the weak. If he still insisted on getting rid of Luo Fan, it was obvious that he had a part in it. The reason why he attacked Luo Fan previously was because he felt a strange feeling of being spied on from Luo Fan. It was as if Luo Fan, whose time attribute had been stagnated, still had perfect thoughts to spy on him. However, now that Senior Sister Mei had said that Luo Fan could become a hidden danger for the Tao Master's position, he had no choice but to take it seriously and think about how to deal with Luo Fan. As Luo Fan listened to their conversation, a faint smile appeared on his face as he said, "Come on, let me see what you're capable of." Senior Sister Mei seemed to see his expression when he was about to face a strong enemy. Senior sister May seemed to see his expression when he was facing her. She also thought of the strange way he would die and come back to life and then die again. She could not help but have an ominous premonition. Obviously, the waxen middle-aged man did not feel the same way Senior Sister May did. At this time, he just sneered. Then, without any nonsense, he raised his hand and pointed at Luo Fan. In an instant, the entire Tao Master's path suddenly began to shrink, crushing toward where Luo Fan was. This crushing contained all the power of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The power was so strong that even a part of the world would be completely crushed and turned into nothingness in an instant. Such a terrifying power directly acted on Luo Fan's body at this time, making him feel that his body was directly crushed by that terrifying power at this moment. As his body was crushed, his power, his life essence, and even his spirit were simultaneously subjected to the boundless terrifying power. They followed in the footsteps of his body and were also crushed to pieces by the power. The entire process was as straightforward as an egg being smashed by an iron hammer. At this time, the existences corresponding to Luo Fan on other levels could not help but exclaim in unison, "Good move." Just now, the waxen middle-aged man's move seemed incredible and seemed to leave no trace. However, with his senses, he was able to clearly see the nature of the attack the moment it arrived. It was the waxen middle-aged man who had instantly created a different time attribute between where he was and the outside world. Because of the difference between the two time attributes, the balance mechanism of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path naturally needed to balance them, thus causing a subtle conflict between them. The emergence of this conflict gave the waxen middle-aged man an opportunity. Under his further adjustment, this conflict produced an unimaginable power that directly acted on his body in the real world. In the end, his body was completely crushed like an egg. This supreme power created with the help of the subtle changes in the time attribute did not contain any new mysteries. It was just a special use of the power that he had displayed before to freeze the time attribute of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, just the way of thinking behind this special use had already given Luo Fan a considerable revelation, allowing him to comprehend many new mysteries in a trance. He even felt that there seemed to be a lot more room for him to excavate the many mysteries that he had previously thought had been explored to the end. After easily crushing Luo Fan, there was no joy on the waxen middle-aged man's face. This kind of victory was too easy. With the strength shown by the individual cultivator, it was impossible for him to be defeated so easily. He must have new tricks that he had not shown yet. Or in other words, he could definitely be resurrected again. How on earth did he resurrect? Come on, let me have a look. This time, I must see your resurrection method clearly. Such a thought flashed through the waxen middle-aged man's mind. Hurry up and destroy his world cluster. Without the world group, his strength will be greatly reduced. Senior Sister May said hurriedly. Hearing this, the waxen middle-aged man just frowned, but did not take any action. What he wanted now was to explore Luo Fan's resurrection method, not to destroy Luo Fan. If the world group was destroyed and Luo Fan died, wouldn't he suffer a great loss? Seeing that the waxen middle-aged man did not move, Senior Sister May became anxious. Chapter 2245. The waxen middle-aged man looked quite serious. He released his perception and carefully sensed everything around him, looking for any changes that were beyond his imagination. If I can get this resurrection method, I don't need to stay in this lower level anymore. This was what he thought at this moment. As a higher existence on the Tao Master's path, the lower level to him was like a kindergarten to a college student. Unless he became a teacher, otherwise, how bad would he have to be to bully children in kindergarten for fun? From this, it could be seen that this waxen middle-aged man was obviously not doing well in the higher level. At least, it was not good enough for him to stay on the Tao Master's path at the higher level. Under such circumstances, the waxen middle-aged man was naturally very eager to strengthen his ability to survive in the higher level. In fact, he might not really have absolute confidence that he could defeat Luo Fan, but he thought that compared to defeating Luo Fan, it was more important to see his means and gain something from his means. Even if Luo Fan had probably completely defeated the disciples of the Tao Master on the 4th level, even if Luo Fan's thoughts were very likely to shake the status of the Tao Master, it was not as important as gaining something from Luo Fan. It was precisely because of this that he would rather wait for Luo Fan to display his means and for Luo Fan to counterattack more fiercely than before. Because his focus was on this aspect, at this moment, he did not pay any attention to Senior Sister May, who was struggling, resisting, and trying hard to correct his mistake, let alone let her out. Just as the waxen middle-aged man was doing his best to pay attention to the surroundings, suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him with an inexplicable smile on his face. The entire process of his appearance was so abrupt and strange. It felt as if he had been there since the beginning of time, but no one had discovered him all this time. Even the waxen middle-aged man didn't notice the process of its appearance at all. He didn't notice the mysterious and extremely strange changes that occurred during the process of its appearance. In other words, he didn't get what he wanted at all, which was to see the secret of Luo Fan's resurrection. How is this possible? At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man's eyes were filled with shock. After all, even if he was not doing well in the 6th level, he was still an expert who was 2 levels higher than Luo Fan on the road of Tao Master. Such a gap was enough for Luo Fan to have no secrets in front of him, and Luo Fan could not understand his existence at all. However, even with such a huge difference, Luo Fan had resurrected right in front of him without any concealment. He could not understand the principle behind it at all, and could not tell what kind of mysteries Luo Fan had used at all. This instantly caused him to recall the setbacks he experienced on the 6th level, and it caused his aura to become slightly unstable. At this moment, Senior Sister May had an extremely helpless look in her eyes. "I told you long ago." Such a thought flashed through her mind. Of course, it was just a thought that flashed through her mind. She naturally wouldn't do something so stupid as offending the waxen middle-aged man and giving him an excuse to vent his anger on her. At this time, Luo Fan grabbed at the surroundings, and a wisp of creation power was already in his hand as if it was a physical object. With a thought, he patted it, and the wisp of creation power instantly broke free from its stagnant state. It directly regained its original vitality and began to jump wildly in his hand. This was him reactivating the time attribute of the creation power, so that the creation power was free from the waxen middle-aged man's control and regained its freedom. In the face of Luo Fan's means, the waxen middle-aged man's expression became increasingly ugly. Then, his expression changed slightly, and he said, "If the first time doesn't work, then 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times." As he spoke, he began to control the time attribute of the entire 4th level, distorting the original balance and causing the entire 4th level to produce an indescribable crushing force that crushed towards Luo Fan from all directions. Just as the terrifying crushing force was about to crush Luo Fan's body, the boundless creation power around him suddenly moved and directly circled around him, instantly blocking the crushing force. The crushing power was so great that even with the obstruction of the Genesis energy, there was still an extremely astonishing power that was transmitted to Luo Fan's body. The force instantly crushed Luo Fan's body into pieces. He seemed to have exploded at this moment, and he turned into minced meat, dust, and powder. However, at this moment, at the place where Luo Fan exploded, Luo Fan's origin of life was completely undamaged, and it instantly started to regenerate everything that had been crushed. His body and strength were instantly restored, as if nothing had happened. It was because the creation power had blocked the time attribute of the entire fourth level, and the crushing force caused by the imbalance in the time attribute of the entire fourth level was finally disrupted, and the power that the waxen middle-aged man had strengthened could no longer be unleashed perfectly. As a result, this power could no longer break Luo Fan's world of the laws. Since it couldn't shatter this world of the laws, it naturally couldn't destroy his origin of life. With Luo Fan's current level, his origin of life was completely undamaged, and it was only a matter of a thought for him to perfectly recover. Naturally, it was extremely easy for him. That was why this situation had occurred at this moment. Faced with such a change, the waxen middle-aged man's eyes were filled with surprise. Going against the flow? There's actually someone who can go against the flow to this level? Luo Fan didn't know how many times he had heard it, but at this time, the same bewildered voice reached his ears. Evidently, the waxen middle-aged man had seen the world of the laws formed by Luo Fan's origin of life, and he knew that Luo Fan had already formed a complete world of the laws, even though it wasn't perfect. At this moment, he looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at an unbelievable monster. It must be known that he knew better than Senior Sister Mei how difficult it was to go against the flow. He also knew how unbelievable it was for someone to be able to do this. Previously, he had only been interested in Luo Fan and wanted to learn the secret of resurrection from Luo Fan. Now, he had already made up his mind to kill Luo Fan. An abnormal existence who could go against the flow and grow beyond the record would definitely be his nightmare if he was allowed to grow. If this person was lucky enough to ascend to the 6th level, then even if he was a disciple of a Tao master, he would definitely not be a match for him. In this case, in this hostile situation, the only thing he could do was to use his strongest means to kill Luo Fan before he grew up. Your killing intent is too strong. Luo Fan looked at this scene and sighed. He could not be clearer about the source of the waxen middle-aged man's killing intent. However, although he knew the source of the killing intent, there was no way for him to calm it down. After all, this kind of killing intent that was born from a different path was the most stubborn killing intent in the world. If he wanted to calm this kind of killing intent, the most direct way was to change his cultivation path and abolish the reverse path that he had spent countless years on. Only in this way could he make the waxen middle-aged man relax his vigilance and stop the strongest killing intent from targeting him. However, how could such a thing happen to Luo Fan? The reason why a path was because it was a cultivation path that he deeply recognized. If he could not even stick to the cultivation path that he deeply recognized, then how could he become a true saint? Wouldn't it be easier to find a place to live his life? You're too dangerous. I can't let you ascend, the waxen middle-aged man said faintly. At this moment, his entire body was surrounded by an incomparably powerful aura. This aura was so powerful that it almost completely enveloped the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. Under this aura, all the creation power on the Tao Master's path seemed to be grasped by invisible hands and began to circulate slowly and orderly. This method is countless times stronger than what I've encountered before. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but become serious. What he had encountered before was naturally the creation power domain displayed by the middle-aged individual cultivator, who had been sealed in the barrier between the reality plane and other planes. Although the method displayed by the waxen middle-aged man was many times larger than the creation power domain displayed by the middle-aged individual cultivator. But in essence the two were the same thing. They were both forcefully manipulating the creation power to create a domain that was completely isolated from the outside world and completely under one's control. If Luo Fan had known how terrifying this kind of domain was, he would not have been in the mood to wait for it to take shape. At this moment, he casually grabbed at the void and waves of creation power directly appeared in his hand. They began to quickly entangle and fuse, and finally, an increasingly powerful creation power appeared in his hand. After the creation power condensed to the size of a star, it suddenly condensed and turned into a three-legged round cauldron, releasing a world-destroying aura and a terrifying aura that was enough to completely collapse the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. This kind of aura was naturally much weaker than the aura released by the waxen middle-aged man. However, it was only in terms of overall quantity. In a small area, this kind of aura was not any weaker than the one released by the waxen middle-aged man. Seeing Luo Fan display this three-legged round cauldron, Senior Sister May's expression changed. She suddenly found that the method displayed by Luo Fan seemed to be the same as before, but in fact, it was fundamentally different from what she had seen last time. In the past, although the three-legged round cauldron was powerful, it could at most use the power of the world group to a certain limit. But now, the three-legged round cauldron not only used the power of the world group to that limit, but also added the mysteries of the first three levels of the Tao Master's path to it. The combination of the three levels and the cauldron formed a strange existence that was similar to the barrier between the domain of the Tao Master and the domain of the individual cultivators, but it was fundamentally different. This kind of mysterious existence had even exceeded the scope of her understanding, causing her to be unable to guess exactly what kind of miraculous power the three-legged round cauldron possessed at this moment, nor did she know how to block this three-legged round cauldron. He has already surpassed me in this level. Even if she could not believe it and was unwilling to admit it, Senior Sister May had to admit that it was a fact. The moment this thought flashed through her mind, her vigilance towards Luo Fan had already been raised to a level that was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before. Her killing intent towards Luo Fan was no less than that of the waxen middle-aged man. This was not because she was jealous, but because she found that her original worries were gradually becoming a reality. I must kill him. I can't let him go any further. Senior Sister May murmured, the killing intent in her eyes almost materializing. Obviously, the waxen middle-aged man was not in the mood to care about the changes that were happening to Senior Sister May. At this moment, he looked at the three-legged round cauldron that had appeared in front of Luo Fan and frowned. You're overestimating yourself. Even I can't perfectly integrate the mysteries of the various levels. You're just an ant on the fourth level, how dare you challenge this? At this moment, he had yet to completely construct the domain that was based on the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan's three-legged round cauldron had already been completed. Due to the difference in scale, his speed was a step slower than Luo Fan's. At this moment, Luo Fan took action. The three-legged round cauldron suddenly slammed towards the waxen middle-aged man. This collision instantly shattered the surrounding creation power, causing the surrounding creation power, which had been frozen by the time attribute and could only be frozen in the void, to be completely shattered by this collision. The creation power, which could not move and could not flow at all, attached to the three-legged round cauldron and wrapped around it, as if the three-legged round cauldron was constantly releasing all kinds of smoke. Chapter 2246. However, the waxen middle-aged man only looked solemn. He didn't panic at all because of this attack that even shattered the power of the time attribute in his surroundings that had been frozen in place. It was as if this kind of attack was only enough to make him pay a little more attention to it. At this moment, the countless light shadows and the four mysterious mysteries inside the three-legged cauldron started to squirm, interweave, and change continuously. For an existence of this level, the attribute of time was something that could be manipulated at will. Therefore, even though the three-legged cauldron seemed to have transcended time and was crashing towards the waxen middle-aged man, there was still an infinite amount of time in the three-legged cauldron, which was enough to make all the powers, mysteries, and elements brew the changes that Luo Fan hoped to see. The various light shadows, powers, and mysteries had been brewing inside the three-legged cauldron for trillions of years. In the end, a bit of subtle light broke through the countless lights, shadows, powers and powers and eventually occupied all the space-time inside the three-legged round cauldron. As a result, the interior of the three-legged round cauldron was completely filled with this bit of light. It felt that all the other powers, lights, shadows and mysteries became so small and insignificant in the face of this light. They couldn't even occupy a bit of space-time in this space-time inside the three-legged round cauldron. Is this all I can do? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was sensing all this, felt a tinge of regret. At this moment, there was a trace of a lively aura in the depths of this light. This lively aura was a sign of a will. If this lively aura could be nurtured and strengthened, it would eventually turn into a will that could think freely and possess great wisdom. However, it was a pity that this bit of active aura was simply too weak. It was so weak that if Luo Fan was not the owner of this light and the owner of the three-legged cauldron, he would not even be able to sense the existence of this lively aura. After discovering this lively aura, he naturally knew what Luo Fan had been doing for such a long time. He was impressively trying to condense that kind of light, or rather, that kind of power, by relying on his understanding of the light that Senior Sister Mei and the middle-aged rogue cultivator had displayed at the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road, which contained the level of the will of heaven and earth. Unfortunately, after such a long time of preparation and using up almost all of his intelligence and inspiration, although he had created the embryonic form of the light, in the end, he could only reach this level. He could barely make the light show a trace of spirituality that belonged to the will of the world. Not to mention Senior Sister Mei and the middle-aged rogue cultivator making the light look like a living thing, it was quite difficult to distinguish this light from normal spiritual light. However, although it only contained a trace of spiritual aura, it was still the condensation of all of Luo Fan's wisdom and inspiration. Compared to all of the other powers inside the three-legged cauldron, all of its power, all of its profundities, and all of its light and shadows, it was already many times stronger than it. When the light appeared, the time in the outside world just happened to flow to the time when the three-legged cauldron had arrived in front of the waxen middle-aged man. At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man's expression suddenly changed. He suddenly discovered that the aura of the three-legged cauldron in front of him had suddenly soared countless times. It was as if it had suddenly transformed from a missile model into a real missile. The degree of danger was already a world of difference from before in the blink of an eye. If it was said that the three-legged cauldron from before could only make him slightly take it seriously, and he was even confident that he could shatter it with a single finger, then this three-legged cauldron already made him feel that it could hurt him. At this critical moment, the waxen middle-aged man let out a soft cry. His palm appeared out of thin air in front of the three-legged cauldron and forcefully pressed down on it. Crack, an earth-shattering and terrifying thunderclap sounded from the point of contact between the two. A huge shock wave was released from that position in an instant and swept in all directions, directly shattering the endless creation power in the surroundings. As for the power of the time attribute that had stagnated the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path that was disrupted by the shock wave, it instantly became chaotic. Amidst the chaos, all the power of creation in the Tao Master's path became chaotic. The creation power, which was originally distributed evenly, stagnated in some places and flowed rapidly in some places. It became bumpy and looked so ugly. The three-legged cauldron collapsed in an instant. Countless cracks wrapped around the three-legged cauldron in a manner that surpassed time. Then, as if at the same time, all the cracks suddenly expanded and directly turned the three-legged cauldron into countless fragments. The three-legged cauldron instantly turned into smoke and fell into the endless creation power in the surroundings. It was completely devoured by the creation power. You came down from the 5th level? The waxen middle-aged man's expression changed greatly at this moment. At this moment, his palm had already collapsed. The powerful shock wave passed through his collapsed palm to his arm, shoulder, and body, causing countless holes to appear on his body in an instant. Blood and power frantically flowed out. Such injuries seemed tragic, but for existences at their level, they were merely superficial wounds. Even if they ignored it, it would take millions of years for their foundation to be slightly shaken. Of course, even so, after suffering such an attack and being in such a sorry state, he should treat his injuries as soon as possible. After all, although it was not fatal, he still looked battered and exhausted. However, at this time, the waxen middle-aged man completely ignored the injuries on his body. He just stared in disbelief at the small light that was revealed after the three-legged cauldron shattered in front of him. It was like a candle in the wind. How keen was his senses! How vast was his knowledge! Naturally, he had already recognized the essence of the light at the first moment. He knew that the light was extremely similar to the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. It could even be said that the two were existences of the same essence. And this was obviously impossible. After all, the display of the power of the Tao Master's prison made him completely certain that the rogue cultivator in front of him had never entered the fifth level. Because of this, he was so shocked and did not dare to believe the truth in front of him. At this moment, the light did not stop because of the waxen middle-aged man's words and power. Instead, it began to stir the endless creation power in the surroundings, causing the endless creation power to give birth to endless unimaginable power. It surged towards the waxen middle-aged man in a manner that completely targeted him. Although the waxen middle-aged man was shocked by the existence of the light, he was extremely disdainful of the light's overestimation. After all, even if the light had a complete consciousness and looked like a living creature, it would not be able to do anything to him. It was impossible for it to move him at all, let alone the light in front of him that only had a little bit of spiritual aura. He even thought that even if he did not put up any defense, the light would not be able to break through his body and leave a mark on him. However, very soon, his expression changed drastically. He quickly dodged backwards and released countless rays of light from his body, condensing into layers of absolute defense around him, trying his best to resist the endless power that was derived from the creation power that was triggered by the light. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind: how can it be so strong? It only has a little bit of spiritual aura, how can it be so strong? He could sense that the power derived from the boundless creation energy that was drawn by the light was completely targeting his weakness. It was targeting the weakness brought about by his advantage in controlling the time attribute around him. To control all the time attribute, it naturally required an extremely deep integration with the time attribute. In this way, the most effective way to deal with his attacks would be to similarly target the time attribute. This was naturally a very difficult thing for a practitioner like Luo Fan, who did not understand the source of his means. However, for the light with a little bit of spiritual aura, it was almost instinctive. It did not even need any command from Luo Fan. It had already grasped the weakness of the waxen middle-aged man as soon as it came into contact with his aura. It could even derive corresponding attacks based on this weakness, which was enough to cause a huge blow to this weakness. In other words, the attack that the waxen middle-aged man was withstanding at this moment. From this moment on, the stagnation of the time attribute on the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to shrink rapidly. The stagnation that originally spread across the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had already shrunk to the range of several world clusters around him in just a few breaths. As this stagnation shrank, the fourth level, which was originally full of potholes, began to become flat and smooth at an unimaginable speed. It looked as if a big hand had wiped the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path out of thin air, completely erasing all the potholes. What's this? How can it be so much stronger than the light of heaven and earth I condensed? At this time, Senior Sister May, who had regained her freedom, was filled with shock. Senior Sister May came from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. She was even more familiar with this kind of living light than the waxen middle-aged man from the 6th level, just like a high school student was more familiar with high school knowledge than a college student. Therefore, she naturally knew more about the strangeness of the light condensed by Luo Fan than the waxen middle-aged man. She could sense that the will of the world contained in that speck of light was so weak that it could not even compare to any of the individual cultivators on the 5th level who had embarked on the normal path of cultivation, let alone her. However, it was this kind of light that actually made the light of heaven and earth she condensed feel a trace of fear. It was as if that light was the natural enemy of her light of heaven and earth. How could this happen? She murmured. She felt that her worldview had been overturned, and she even began to doubt her own path of cultivation. With this change of mood, the light in her body faintly shone, and her aura began to wantonly release from her body. It stirred the surroundings in a chaotic manner, adding a part of her power to the chaos of the surrounding creation power. Wah! After a while, the chaos in her body reached a certain extreme, causing her body to suddenly become sluggish. She spat out a mouthful of blood. There was a faint light in this mouthful of blood. After it left her body, it began to change rapidly, absorbing the boundless power of creation in the surroundings. It began to give birth to all kinds of strange light shadows, power, space-time, world, heaven and earth. However, all these derivations were quickly annihilated in the aftermath of the battle between the light and the waxen middle-aged man, as if they had never appeared. With this catharsis, although Senior Sister May's body was severely damaged, her mind was clear. This person is walking on the path of going against the flow of time, and it's a record-setting path of going against the flow of time. Perhaps it's because of this that the light of heaven and earth that he condensed is a little special. It's not a problem with my cultivation. This thought suppressed all the messy thoughts in her heart, allowing her to sort out her thoughts again. However, although she suppressed all the negative thoughts in her heart, there were still some doubts in her heart. After all, there was still a reason why the path of going against the flow of time was special. Explaining everything with the uniqueness of the path of going against the flow of time was still a form of evasion. For Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, which only contained a weak spiritual aura, to be so much more powerful than the light of heaven and earth that she condensed, there should be an explanation that she could understand. However, although there were still some doubts in her heart, after the blow just now, Senior Sister May already knew that it was impossible for her to get any results by dwelling on it. Instead, it would cause her to go berserk. Therefore, she could only forcefully suppress this trace of doubt and plan to wait until she could face this doubt more rationally in the future before investigating the reason behind it. At this moment, she only started to repair her body and cautiously guarded against the aftermath of the battle that could drown her at any time. At this moment, the waxen middle-aged man was already exhausted from running for his life. All sorts of different means were constantly appearing in his hands as he pounced towards the light, trying his best to destroy it. However, all of his means seemed to have been predicted by the light. No matter how strange the means were, the light seemed to be controlling the creation power at the same time to counter it, and it easily resisted it. It even countered the weakness of the waxen middle-aged man's new means, forcing the waxen middle-aged man to change his means to resist. Chapter 2247. The reason why Luo Fan's so-called light of the heavens and earth had such unimaginable power in such an imperfect situation was actually very simple. It was because he had personally simulated the true will of the heavens and earth. He did not know how to cultivate the 5th level of the Tao Master's path and how to condense a light of heaven and earth that was similar to the will of heaven and earth. However, even if this was the Tao Master's path, even if it was really built out of thin air, it was unlikely for any cultivator who had entered the 5th level of the Tao Master's path to become the will of heaven and earth. If one did not personally become the will of heaven and earth, then no matter how much research and analysis one had on the will of heaven and earth, it would ultimately be like scratching an itch through one's boot. What one had obtained was merely the surface of the will of heaven and earth, and could not truly obtain the essence of the will of heaven and earth. In this way, the light of the world that they had condensed seemed to possess a perfect will that was similar to the will of the world, making it seem as if it was alive. However, it was actually just a living will with a trace of the nature of the will of heaven and earth. Even the trace of the will of heaven and earth was superficial, and it was difficult for one to truly obtain the true power of the will of heaven and earth. In contrast, Luo Fan had not gone through the fifth level of the Tao Master's path at all. He had completely relied on his own deduction and tried his best to condense the light of heaven and earth with all the cultivation achievements he had mastered. Naturally, it was many times more difficult than the cultivators who had the guidance of the fifth level. However, it was precisely because of this that he was able to completely integrate all kinds of understanding and traces left behind in the process of simulating the will of heaven and earth into the light, and then make the will contained in the light more similar to the will of heaven and earth than the will contained in the light of heaven and earth condensed by most of the fifth-level cultivators. At least, in comparison, the level of the will contained in the light of heaven and earth condensed by Senior Sister May and the waxen middle-aged man could not compare to the spiritual aura contained in the light. As for whether the light of heaven and earth condensed by other fifth-level cultivators was more similar to the will of heaven and earth than his, it was not something that could be found out for now. Luo Fan naturally did not understand all of this in the beginning. However, as time passed, as the changes that the speck of light displayed became more and more powerful, and as the difference between this speck of light and the light that he had come into contact with before became more and more obvious, he gradually understood the crux of the matter. A smile of enlightenment gradually appeared on his face. "So that's how it is. So they're not as strong as I thought," he muttered. There was joy in his heart, but also an indescribable sense of loss. To him, all of his experiences, all of his methods, and all of his decisions were all for the sake of improving himself and allowing him to comprehend new things, allowing him to take a step closer to becoming a true divine. Under such circumstances, the stronger the enemy was, the more ingenious the enemy's methods would be. Although it would be more dangerous for him, it would also bring him more enlightenment and more rewards. The higher-level cultivators were weaker than he had imagined. This made the danger he might encounter less, but it also made the things he could learn less. This naturally made him happy, but also a little disappointed. After understanding the intrinsic advantage of the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed, he could not be clearer about how he should make use of it. At this moment, all of his senses, comprehension, and thoughts from the process of simulating the will of the world in the shattered world appeared out of thin air again, and he poured them into the speck of light without holding back. As a huge amount of information was poured in, the spiritual aura in the speck of light began to skyrocket. However, this skyrocketing did not make the light transform into a living thing. On the contrary, it made the light transform in a direction that became less and less existent. It was as if it had unknowingly become a phenomenon in the world, a rule of the operation of the great Tao, and a strange manifestation of the chaotic state. As this change occurred, the range of its control over the surrounding creation power became larger, and the changes produced by the creation power also became more complicated and profound. The power it produced also became more and more terrifying. Originally, the waxen middle-aged man could barely cope with it, but at this moment, after the light changed, he realized that the pressure he had to endure had suddenly skyrocketed by many times. Previously, it was as if all of his methods, past and future, had been seen by the other party. This way, no matter what he used, he would encounter the most targeted response, making it difficult for his methods to truly be effective. However, at the end of the day, he still had the freedom to choose how to attack and how to change his method. However, at this moment, he realized that he had already become a part of the other party. All of his methods seemed to be responding to the other party, and in the end, they were all used by the other party to create a terrible environment for him, making his situation worse and worse. Unknowingly, he had already fallen into the worst situation he could imagine. All the attacks that he had launched before that could threaten him were coming from all directions. At this moment, these attacks completely treated him as a target, making him feel like the shadow of death had completely shrouded him. How did it develop to this extent? At this moment, this thought flashed across the waxen middle-aged man's mind. With this thought in mind, everything that he had done and used previously appeared in his mind again. Even when he thought back, he felt that there was no problem with his response at all. All of the changes in his abilities and methods were the best response to the situation at that time. However, it was precisely because of this that everything that was incomparably correct had finally developed into this situation. He could be completely torn apart in the next moment, and everything would turn into bubbles. Everything seemed to be the result of countless coincidences piling up together. Why? How can such a silent method appear on a cultivator who hasn't even stepped into the 5th level? This thought kept flashing in his mind. With this thought, his body gradually became illusory, as if some kind of power was pulling him out of the 4th level. Silently, the area where he had originally been was completely annihilated. All the power of creation gave birth to countless destructive powers at this moment, constantly transmitting in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path, causing almost all the nature of the power of creation to change. Fortunately, the source of the power of creation in the 4th level of the Tao Master's path was the entire Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, as long as the source was not affected, even if the power of creation was completely subverted and destroyed, it could quickly recover. Therefore, in the eyes of Luo Fan, it was only a moment, but in the eyes of the power of creation itself, all the changes of the power of creation completely disappeared in a period of time that seemed to be millions of years. The entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path looked no different from the beginning, as if nothing had happened. At this moment, the barrier that originally covered the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path and completely separated the domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master's path also disappeared at the same time, leaving no trace. The domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master's path, which were originally completely separated, were now completely integrated as if they had never been separated. At this moment, the entire 4th level of the Tao Master's path was no longer as empty as before. Countless individual cultivators were constantly struggling, recovering from the erosion of the power of creation again and again, trying hard to prevent themselves from being assimilated by the power of creation. The clusters of worlds constructed by the many itinerant cultivators were like specks of light in the boundless darkness. They provided a place for the many itinerant cultivators to settle down, so most of them would not end up like the itinerant cultivators who could not make it to the clusters of worlds in time, constantly being destroyed by the power of creation and struggling with great difficulty. You've achieved your goal, haven't you? At this moment, Senior Sister May's somewhat inexplicable voice came into his ears. Luo Fan smiled slightly, raised his hand, and the light that exuded spiritual aura fell into his hand, turning into a small flame that floated like a candle. Then, he turned his head to look at the source of the voice. Senior Sister May floated there, surrounded by the power of the world clusters, completely isolating herself from the power of creation in the outside world. There was an unconcealable sorrow in her eyes, which made her originally charming and inexplicably pitiful, which made her even more alluring. I've only reached the first step. Luo Fan did not hide and just said so. Isn't your goal to liberate the individual cultivators? To let the individual cultivators have the same cultivation environment as us Tao Masters? Senior Sister May frowned and said, "Who told you that my purpose was this?" Luo Fan just smiled and asked back, "Who else needs to tell you? Every action and every decision you make is for this result, isn't it? Senior Marshal Sister May's expression remained the same as before. Luo Fan laughed and said, "No, no. What does the grudges and treatment between the Tao Masters and the individual cultivators have to do with me? It doesn't matter if the individual cultivators have a poor cultivation environment or a wonderful one. What does it matter to me?" Senior Sister May's eyes were filled with surprise. She had always thought that Luo Fan was doing it for the rights of the individual cultivators, and because of this, she felt that Luo Fan's thoughts were so dangerous. After all, an enemy with strength, will, and ideas was the most dangerous enemy. However, if Luo Fan only had strength and ideas, but no will, it would still not be safe, but the degree of danger would be much smaller than before. Then what's your goal? Senior Sister May frowned and asked. There was doubt in her eyes, but suddenly, she had a flash of inspiration. She remembered how Luo Fan had treated the disciples of the Tao Masters in the 4th level. She could not help but exclaim, "You want to take all the individual cultivators into your own world group and let them help you cultivate?" After saying this, she looked at Luo Fan as if she was looking at a madman. It was acceptable for him to treat the disciples of the Tao Masters like this. The more ruthless he was, the more prestige he would have in the hearts of the individual cultivators. The more powerful the individual cultivators were, the more favorable they would be to him. However, if he treated the rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Master equally and treated all the rogue cultivators the same way he treated the disciples of the Tao Master, then in the eyes of the rogue cultivators, he would be a madman who would bite anyone he saw. Not to mention that the lower-level individual cultivators would see him as an enemy. Even the higher-level individual cultivators might not like him and attack him. This was equivalent to cutting off all the other cultivators. Madman! You're a complete madman, Senior Sister May said with a look of horror. Hearing this, Luo Fan did not take it seriously. He smiled and said, "Haven't I always been a madman in your eyes? If I'm not a madman, why would I choose the wrong path?" Hearing this, Senior Sister May did not relax at all. She still looked at Luo Fan as if she was looking at a madman. However, there was an additional sense of pity in her eyes. "You're finished. Unless you never ascend, once you step into the 5th level, you will no longer have a foothold. Whether it's the disciples of the Tao Masters or the individual cultivators, they will definitely kill you the moment you appear." Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression did not even change. He said, "If that's the case, then there's nothing I can do. I entered the Tao Master's path to constantly improve myself and eventually become a Tao Master. I didn't enter to join any organization to be kind to others. The disciples of the Tao Masters? Individual cultivators? What's the difference between becoming a true divine? Since ancient times, I've never heard that it's easier for an individual cultivator to become a sage than a Tao Master. I've also never heard that it's easier for a Tao Master to become a sage than an individual cultivator. If that's the case, what's the point of forcibly dividing yourself into groups?" Senior Sister May's expression froze slightly. She did not expect Luo Fan to say such a thing. This was actually not a great secret. In fact, from ancient times to the present, anyone who had some understanding of the Tao Master's background would know that among all the Tao Masters, there was not much difference in the ratio between those who were originally disciples of the Tao Master and those who were originally individual cultivators. That was to say, the ratio of all the disciples of a Tao Master and the ratio of the individual cultivators to the Tao Master was very small. It was as if becoming a Tao Master had nothing to do with all the previous cultivation methods. It was completely dependent on the final opportunity. Under such circumstances, the theory that becoming a Tao Master had nothing to do with the previous identity naturally came into being. However, for the disciples of a Tao Master, this conclusion was obviously not something they were willing to accept. Therefore, after a long period of cultivation, they became more and more aware that the gap between the disciples of a Tao master and the individual cultivators became larger and larger with the improvement of their cultivation realms. This theory had been unknowingly ignored by all the disciples of a Tao master. It was almost their wishful thinking that becoming a disciple of a Tao master meant that one was naturally closer to becoming a Tao master than an individual cultivator. Becoming a disciple of a Tao master meant that the probability of becoming a Tao master was naturally higher than that of an individual cultivator. Senior Sister Mei was also a disciple of one of the Tao masters who had unknowingly ignored this theory. However, at this time, when she heard Luo Fan using such a theory to support her crazy behavior, the barrier that had originally covered her mind was finally completely broken. It reminded her of the statistics about the origin of the Tao master that had been secretly circulated all along. A kind of inexplicable confusion gradually emerged from the bottom of her heart. Along with this bewilderment, the doubts she had accumulated about the strange power of Luo Fan's light of the world also appeared. Originally, she had already suppressed this doubt because it might shake the foundation of her cultivation and the way of her cultivation. Under such circumstances, even if she forcibly suppressed this doubt, in the end, it could only treat the symptoms but not the root cause. Once things changed, this doubt would naturally resurface. After all, doubt was doubt. Even if you suppressed it, you would just ignore it. This kind of neglect was like deceiving oneself and others. When this deception was uncovered, it would naturally erupt again. And now, Luo Fan's words, which coincided with the previous secret statistics, were like a powerful hand that uncovered all the deceptions that she had been deceiving others and herself. This made the doubts that had been suppressed in the bottom of her heart finally burst out without reservation. With this eruption of doubt, the aura of her body began to inexplicably become chaotic. At this time, the light of heaven and earth, which she had originally condensed with difficulty, involuntarily emerged from her body and began to sway around her body, causing the surrounding power of creation to constantly change in various strange forms in the process. This kind of change was somewhat similar to the various changes that had occurred when Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth fought with the waxen middle-aged man, but it was far less flexible, natural, and untraceable than the changes caused by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. If one had to forcibly compare the two, one was like the real heaven and earth, while the other was like a crude artificial simulation of heaven and earth. On purpose? At this time, Luo Fan suddenly frowned and this thought flashed through his mind.